Welcome to Armchair Expert, Experts on Expert. I'm Dan Shepard, and I'm joined by Monica Monsoon.
Hi.
We have another Morris. We had a Morris recently.
That's right.
We're on a tear of Morrises.
Who else should we have that's a Morris?
Great question.
Zach Morris?
Zach Morris.
That'd be great.
Morris Day from The Time. Prince's rival in Purple Rain.
Oh, okay.
Morris the cat.
Oof, I'm failing big time.
There's another Morris.
William Morris?
William Morris, the, I think, probably deceased agent.
Oh.
William Morris Agency, where I'm a member.
Well, there's a lot more we can have. I'm
okay.
excited.
So point is, we'll try to keep them coming. But this Morris, Michael Morris, is a cultural psychologist and professor at Columbia University, and he has a great book out called Tribal: How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Bring Us Together. I really like this one because we hear so much about tribalism. I'm always talking about it, and I exclusively talk about it in a negative light. And he's here to talk about kind of the very positive side of tribalism.
And the way we can use those positive pieces to bring us together, actually.
Counteract the negative pieces. Yeah.
It's
so
really
this is a
good.
great one. Please enjoy Michael Morris.
He's an armchair expert. He's an armchair expert. He's an armchair expert. He's an armchair.
You would live in New York. You teach at Columbia.
I live in New York, yeah.
And so you're in LA right now.
Yep.
Is that a trip you look forward to, or you?
Oh, of course, yeah. I lived in California for 10 years, probably like the best years of my life.
You have a California vibe
Yeah.
in a good way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool vibe.
Chill, relax.
Yeah.
Were these the Stanford years?
Yeah. And
Okay.
I always admired California. My family is sort of from New York. I always saw New York as sort of like mired in the past. And I saw Californians as these enlightened beings, who
Liberated from tradition?
eat better food,
Sure.
they don't, the genders aren't as bifurcated. The teenagers don't seem to have the same awkward years. East Coast awkward years are really awkward.
Yeah.
Like New Jersey awkward is really awkward. I know you're from Michigan, right?
Yeah, in Atlanta.
Georgia.
Atlanta? Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
And you're from New York. What part of New York?
I was born in the city and my parents were from the city, but then they started having too many kids. And so they kind of moved upstate, moved around erratically, and then landed in a place called Liberty, a town called Liberty, which is in the Catskill Mountains.
Ooh,
It's
beautiful.
where, if you've ever seen Dirty Dancing,
Oh, sure.
it's where Dirty Dancing was set,
Set.
not where it was filmed.
Lake Lure, North Carolina.
That's where it was filmed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
And you did your PhD at U of M?
I did. Yeah.
You did. And did you like living in Michigan? You can be honest.
Yeah. I think my answer is probably not atypical, right?
Yeah.
I was, I grew up in this little, I can call it a shit town, right? A little shit town. Are we on? Or are we? we're not?
Endearingly.
Oh,
Oh, yeah. We're always.
We're ABR.
Okay. Yeah, when does this start?
We don't know. We don't know when it ends for sure. Very loosey-goosey.
One of the first podcasts I ever listened to was Shit Town. Have you ever heard that
Oh,
podcast?
yeah.
love
S-Town.
Yeah.
That's such
And
a
that was
good
the
one.
word that everyone in my town used, not when they were trying to be derisive, but just when they were trying to be factual, when they were trying to be descriptive.
Yeah.
So I grew up there. And then I went to I didn't get into any colleges. I was kind of a jerk in high school, kind of deviant, sort of,
What was your
Satanist.
perversion? Was it music? Was it the occult?
I was kind of like, I was one of the kids who took some leadership roles, but then I was always being subversive. So at one point they asked me to do the morning announcements.
Yeah.
And in a public school, you're all sitting in your homerooms and you're listening to the announcements. And so it would always be like, will the following students please report to the vice principal's office? James Miller, Jimi Hendrix, something. And I would be slipping in or fake names that
So rascal. You were a rascal.
a bit of that. And I always thought people liked me, but I realized afterwards that I made the teachers' jobs really difficult. Once I became a teacher, and I realized having a person sitting on the side of the room just making jokes constantly through it's not making it easier for you to get through.
I'm guilty of it too.
I didn't get in any colleges that I applied to. I went to a couple colleges in New York State and went on a program to London, and then I got into Brown, mostly through distance running, because I had become a distance runner in the colleges that I went to.
Did you major in psychology there as undergrad?
I didn't. No, I did a literature degree. At Brown, there aren't many requirements. You know,
Okay.
it's sort of a cafeteria style college. And what a lot of people at Brown do is they take courses each semester that they like, and then they're informed that they have completed the requirements for the history degree, which is like take 4 history classes. You know, it's like very minimal. So
That
like,
works well with how the human brain works, because we like to do a bunch of random things and then in retrospect put them in an order that seems to make sense.
Yeah.
So that's like almost the approach.
yeah.
It's like do whatever the hell you want, and then in reflection we'll go, well, that was clearly ancient Rome degree.
Right.
Yeah.
And those are the two sides of our brain. Like the intuitive brain just makes choices, and we feel in our gut it's the right choice, and we're committed to it. And then the rational brain is a sort of after the fact sense maker that carves a narrative or contrives a narrative, connects the dots.
We can make sense of anything retroactively.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I'm great at it. I'm like, every step I took seems like it led precisely to where I'm at.
Yeah, it's a danger that we are so facile at rationalizing things. And I think when I teach that material, one of the main things I try to teach people, because they're smart kids, I teach them, you know, smart people have a real fallibility of believing their own bullshit because their brains are so able to justify anything they do or anything, you know, and so it's the intellectual humility of knowing that 90% of your choices are being made by your intuition that you have no access to and no control over, and that, you know, gets it wrong 8 out of 10 times. That's sort of what we want to teach them.
Yeah.
There's also a concept in statistics, just regression to the mean. If somebody does something extraordinary, chances are their next performance will be less extraordinary. And so like really smart parents tend to have kids who are smarter than average, but not as smart as them. Or, you know, so some of that might be just that science is largely chance. I mean, like you have to be, you know, some intelligence is the price of admission, but then do you happen to work on a problem that gives way to your particular attack on the problem? And that's largely chance.
So you leave there with a literature degree and then you go directly to U of M, or?
I also did a cognitive science degree, which is, at the time at least, it was a mix of some computer science, like especially artificial intelligence style computer science, some linguistics, especially the more Noam Chomsky, you know, formal linguistics, and then some philosophy of mind and some cognitive psychology. So there was a bit of psychology in there.
Do you think you knew what question you were trying to answer as a human?
I was really intrigued, you know, by some books at that time. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen Doug Hofstadter's books, like Gödel, Escher, Bach, you know, where he is kind of one of these physicists who integrates physics with music and other things. It was a time when, you know, the cognitive revolution in psychology was coming together with early artificial intelligence. You know, artificial intelligence was really promising then, and then kind of had a hiatus for about 30 years. And now, kabam, it's back. You know, it's back.
Yeah.
It's so exciting now. It's changing every 6 months. It's really...
Yeah, it's hard to keep up with. Okay, so but when we get to U of M, we now must focus more specifically on a chosen field, I'm presuming.
I mean, I wanted to go to the U of M. We were talking about Michigan at first. You know, when I was a college student, the poster on my wall was always Bob Dylan. And I was kind of seduced by a combination of Bob Dylan and Garrison Kaler to think that the Midwest was this mystical, magical, honest fountain of good, you know, and that
Minnesota might still be, but not the rest of it. Where Garrison Keillor was, maybe.
Yeah. And I had grown kind of sick of New England and, you know, the Ivy League experience, at least that I had, of being sort of a fish out of water. So I thought, oh, let me go to a big first rate, but a sort of state land grant college, you know, in the Midwest and see the real American experience, basically.
Yeah, no airs.
At Brown, there were a lot of kids who went by the name like Fleetwood or Che. But then you would say, well, what's Che's real name? And it's like, oh, it's Franklin Roosevelt, you know, Cabot Lodge III, you know. And so Michigan was fun. When I first got there, I remember I would say, where are you from? And they'd say, I'm from the Thumb. You know, I'd be like,
Yeah.
Oh,
and then
the
hold, They hold up the mitten, and
From the thumb.
and I was just enchanted by the place for probably a year. And then I realized, after having gone to like 4 or 5 different colleges in 4 years, my feet were always moving.
Yeah.
And now I realized I was supposed to stay there for 4 more years in a relatively small.
Ann Arbor's tiny.
Yeah, it's got a lot of richness, and some of the most interesting people I've ever met. At the hotel where I'm staying, the lobby is decorated with the paintings of a girl that I used to babysit for.
No way.
Really?
Yeah. Her name is Koak. She's an internationally known artist, but I've never walked into a boutique hotel and seen her paintings in the lobby.
Wow.
Are you staying at Cara?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Her artist name is Koak. And I think it stands for Kristen Olsen Artist Company because her name is Kristen Olsen.
Okay.
So she kind of uses a kind of simple name.
I go
that.
there all the time, and I have noticed that the art there is incredible.
Oh,
So that's so funny.
Independently, you.
Yeah.
found
Yeah.
that.
In fact, I think I asked the manager, like, can I buy some of this? And
Oh, he said you can't afford it.
yeah, they said,
You're
we'll get back to you. And then they never did.
Well, she's great because she, her stuff sells at the best galleries in Paris, but she always puts out, like limited edition print things, so that everyone can participate in her
Yeah.
art
us losers.
one way or the other.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So did you leave U of M with a PhD in psychology?
Yeah, it was in social psychology.
Right.
And social psychology is kind of a catch-all for, the areas of psychology that aren't about rats and pigeons or blinking. They're like the really micro processes tend to be called cognitive psychology.
Okay.
And then even a lot of cognition falls under social psychology because it's the study of the messier side of the brain. Right?
Yeah. How it's interfacing with society.
Everything.
And it's like the inter instead of inner look at psychology.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the interpersonal. That was sort of the classic definition. So I often call myself, like when I get on a plane or something, I say I'm a behavioral scientist. And that tells
It shuts them up.
Yeah, well, I used to say I'm a psychologist, but not the type that helps people.
Oh, there you go.
But that kind of sets a bad tone.
So where you've landed though, and what you're doing currently at Columbia, if I am right about this, is you're doing an interdisciplinary approach, right? You're now doing cultural psychology, which is a fusion of anthropology and psychology, which again seems very obvious. Like,
Right.
Duh, of course, right?
Yeah, in hindsight, it's sometimes hard to explain to people why the contributions that I made early in my career were contributions because they seem completely obvious, and they're just kind of in the air now. Like young graduate students are like, you discovered that? There was a time when people didn't know that? What did people assume then?
Yeah, and will you brag for a second and tell me some of the things you were working on that at the time were novel and proprietary that are now kind of standard?
So what happened to me was that the only colleges that were interested in me were really quirky places, like Reed College interviewed me, places like that.
Yeah.
But then once they met me, I was too quirky for them. And then weirdly, I got a request from, I think, the Northwestern Business School. Would you apply for our job? Because we heard about your paper with somebody. And so I applied for that job. They really liked me. It went well. And then the next week, Stanford and University of Chicago emailed me, would you apply for our job?
Whoa.
And I didn't think any of these places would hire me because I didn't know anything about business. I was kind of a hippie, even relative to the other psychologists. Didn't. But then I got job offers from all these business schools. And so I was like, I guess the world is telling me something, that the sort of innovative twist on psychology that I'm doing might find a larger audience in the business school world. I saw you had Mike Norton on your show, and he's a similar story to me.
Yeah, he didn't understand why he ended up at Harvard.
At Harvard,
Yeah.
A quirky guy.
His explanation was that he knew how to run human experiments, and all these businesses and corporations are dying to figure out what makes their employees work better.
Yep.
But along the way, what were some of the things? I guess I'm
things that
looking
I
for
worked
a
on?
couple few
Sure.
steps before
Yeah.
we land on tribalism.
Great. One of the areas that I worked in, or that I was surrounded by when I was studying psychology, was the study of biases in social judgment. So social judgment is this everyday sense making. We walk down the street, we see a person yelling at a car, and then we have to make sense of it. Like, Did the driver do something wrong? Is the person schizophrenic? Are they just having a bad day and it's spillover from that? And one of the biggest principles in social psychology, it was called the fundamental attribution error, was this idea that we get personal about things that are all about the situation.
Yeah.
And so we meet someone in a library, we jump to the conclusion they're introverted because they're speaking softly. We don't take into account it's a library. My favorite example of this is Dave Chappelle, the comedian.
We love him.
He's like, on Sesame Street, everyone is so quick to say Oscar is a grouch. He's the poorest Muppet on Sesame Street. He lives in a garbage can. Take into account his situation. It's like, but that's how we like to think, grouch. But so that was certainly a true thing about Western societies where most of the research was done. But I was living in a household of all people freshly arrived from China. And it was a time of a lot of ferment because Tiananmen Square had happened. And so there was a lot of, comparing notes where I would say, to me, it looks like this happened. And they'd be like, no, it's this happened. Even Tiananmen Square, like I saw it as some courageous student leaders, inspiring the rest of the country to come. They were like, no, it happened by accident. There were a few people doing a hunger strike that happened to correspond with the end of the school year. And then so many more people arrived. And I'm friends with some of the student leaders who live in New York, and they concur with that they are accidental heroes. They didn't they didn't know what was going on either, and it's just but in any case, we kept finding that whether we were talking about what happened at the party we went to together or what happened in the news, that their worldview, their social interpretation was different from mine. Mine was more the fundamental attribution error, which is if somebody wins a prize, oh, they're a genius. Or if somebody screws up, oh, they're irresponsible. And they were always like, well, because their parents supported them, they won the prize. Or because the manager wasn't a good mentor, that's why the employee screwed up. So they were always explaining things with regard to the collective. Yeah. And, at first I thought they were just more polite, but then I realized that they were doing it even when it wasn't polite. And so I was working with a guy from China named Kaiping Peng, who currently has the most popular podcast in China. He's gone on to do that.
He probably dwarfs Rogan because he's got 1 billion people to choose from.
Of course.
He probably has the most popular podcast in the world if he has the most popular podcast in China.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Was he as fascinated with you as you were with him? Because I think that's the fun.
Yeah.
Therein lies the absolute fun of being around different things and different people.
He and I are a lot alike. We're both like creative people who race through different associations and stuff. But when I would tell him about my people, he thought it was bizarre. And when he would tell me about his people, I thought it was bizarre. And he and I were kind of misfits in our own societies, like most professors are anyways. Yeah. And so we worked together, and then we had to come up with ways to test this idea that the go-to social bias in Western culture is different than the go-to social bias in Chinese culture.
Right. It's not a human bias. It's a cultural bias.
Right. And before, that's how it was described. It was called, the psychology of, human inference, human social biases. And I thought, okay, this bias has a lot to do with individualism, right? This pressure to think of each individual as a island and as character's destiny.
Whatever thing they accomplish is theirs entirely. Whatever failures theirs entirely.
Right. Like in Japan, when somebody invents something that makes billions of dollars for their company, they get like a $300 bonus,
Right, nice watch.
And here, the intellectual property regime, it's all about the individual inventor, and we kind of ignore that. Well, they were standing on the shoulders of giants, because we just kind of reduce the messiness of reality to a simple narrative about great men and great women.
Yeah. Do you think that's a Western obsession with celebrity?
It's related. It's definitely related. But I think it shows up even like in classical Chinese painting. More often, it's a view from a distance of a group of people, and with us, it's like central character, main character.
Yeah.
We were trying to figure out how we could, in a culture fair way, test that the biases were different. Yeah. And so one of the things we did that made a big splash was we made cartoons with like a really early animation program for Max. And some of the cartoons were of physical objects like a soccer ball rolling across a field, hitting another soccer ball. And then some of the cartoons were animals, and we eventually settled on fish. So we would have an individual fish, like over here on the left, and then a group of fish, and they would swim like that. So the individual is swimming in front of the group. And then we would ask, why did the blue fish over here move? And that was just the open-ended question. And Americans would tend to say things like, he decided he wanted to explore.
Probably. Always.
Or, it, or even if it was it, it's the leader.
And they're all following.
The Chinese people saw either the group is expelling a member or the group is chasing a member. It's like, which is the cause and which is the effect,
Yes.
And Americans kind of defaulted to the individual is the cause and China as the effect, because it was something that, when Americans see it, they can't really see it any other way.
Right.
And then Chinese people will be like, no, it's plainly, influence from the group.
In some objective way, they're weirdly objectively correct. Like the notion that you would focus on the singular and not the group is just numerically, it's kind of funny.
Yeah.
Because I would too. I'd be like, what's this motherfucker up to? He's going to show them where some cod is or something, right?
I think that helped. That helped at different times in the past. Work on culture was considered to be not politically correct in leftist, Marxist sociology circles.
Yeah.
Because the idea was everything is caused by social class and culture is an illusion. But because we were pointing out a cultural difference where the East Asians looked smarter than the Westerners, it was more palatable, right? It was more palatable than, because a lot of the previous stuff would be like, Westerners are linear. Cognitive anthropologists would be like, this, peasant group in the mountains of Uzbekistan, they don't have logic. They have, a web-based mentality or a holistic mentality or something like that. And that could easily read as dismissive.
The leftist progressive North Star is that we're all the same, maybe.
Yep.
Right. And then a history of anytime we delineated differences, it was generally with the goal of subjugating one of those groups we figured was inferior to us. So it's like some pushback to the history. But yeah, it's insane to me that we're not allowed to point out these incredible differences. They're so fascinating.
I've always been interested as a former distance runner of like the preponderance of world-class marathoners that come from particular groups in particular regions of Kenya who live at high altitude,
right?
But like not from Tibet, And then I learned that these groups all have different local adaptations, biological adaptations to living with lower oxygen, but they have different ones, right?
And then there's a cultural component on top of that, right?
Then there's
how they're moving between villages.
They grow up running 10 miles to go to school and 10 miles back, which is the optimal way to train in childhood rather than racing all the time, which can give you injuries.
And by the way, it's worthwhile because I think we do have aspirational goals as a group, as a culture, as everything. And it's worthwhile to see how other people do things and what the outcome of it is. It's like there's a very pragmatic outcome of figuring out what we're all doing differently and what are the results of those different approaches.
It's just negative if America or the West is centered. It's like it just has to be America does this, China. It's not like so they're different. It's like we're all different.
That's
where I think things get a little more people push back.
Exactly. You studied anthropology, I take it.
Yes.
So the field of anthropology has had an extended crisis over that. The classic early anthropologists, mostly from Europe, were funded by their government as part of the colonialist project.
Yeah.
Like, please go document these people. And if you don't mind, please emphasize the need for Western missionaries, armies, and hospitals. And I don't think anthropologists were they certainly were not deliberately trying to exploit the people they studied, but they just weren't politically aware in the old days. And they slipped into language, contrasting European civilization with non-Western tribes.
And using the word primitive a lot.
Yes.
Is problematic.
And, there were societies in Central America and South America that were equal to most European societies at the time in terms of scale, in terms of their mathematics, in terms of their astronomy.
Yeah.
And there were in Africa as well.
Yeah.
But they didn't, the Western anthropologists didn't always see that.
If you want to go down that road, Guns, Germs, and Steels is a great ride through
Yeah.
that history.
It's an amazing book. Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the books that was sort of a model for me in trying to write a book that is a serious intellectual book, but also readable. You know,
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
You've accomplished that, by the way. Your book is really, really fun. It's
thank you.
very Gladwell-esque.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. Malcolm is a friend of mine, and I've always admired The Tipping Point as a wonderful book that just gives ideas, you know, the power of action. You know, it's like reading a detective novel.
Well, you have a parallel story in your book, weirdly, the Korean soccer team,
Yeah.
which we'll talk about, and Korean Air, his chapter
Yeah.
on Korean Air.
Yeah.
And crazily
Outlands.
enough, virtually the exact same situation and solution.
Yeah.
It's kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
So you did that. You did these the fish test.
That landed as basically there are different biases that come from different cognitive frames being in the foreground
Yeah.
as a function of your culture, and the idea of culture as a constellation of cognitive frameworks that guide people's sense making and thinking. And so then people just sort of accepted that there's the Eastern worldview that carries with it certain biases and the Western worldview that carries with it certain biases. And that's kind of how I got hired by Stanford and how I got sort of early notoriety in the
Yeah.
field. And then I wanted to understand better because I hadn't spent significant time in China.
Yeah.
And so I took a couple years and spent most of the year at universities in Hong Kong, where I taught and I conducted research with local scholars who are also interested in cultural comparison.
How affected was that data set by being under English rule? It almost feels like it potentially could be a hybrid.
It is, but you know, when you're doing these natural experiments, when you're doing these comparisons, you sometimes want that, right? At the time I was studying differences in conflict resolution and dispute resolution preferences. Like, why do Americans always want to go to court? And why do people in East Asian cultures tend to use a mediator or just negotiate it?
Yeah.
And again, their approach seems a little wiser, you know, like a little more practical than ours. So I wanted a place that was roughly equal to, say, New York or San Francisco in wealth,
Yeah.
in sort of population density, and having a legal system which was the sort of Western adjudicatory legal system, so that if I still observed differences in people's preferences, that it wasn't coming from the social structure being different. You know, that they're like, if it was in rural China, sure, they use a mediator because there's no other
They
option.
No other
have
option.
it.
Yeah. You're
But-
getting to see people decide, I guess.
Yeah.
or pick.
But it's still, but your concern is still a very legitimate one, because, you know, you might say, okay, they're not using the legal system because it's this funny English tradition where people would
wigs.
wear the wigs, and, you know.
That
so,
would turn me out of a courtroom.
It's so weird.
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, it's different.
No, you're allowed to make fun of white people.
Oh, yeah.
Remember?
Yeah, it's weird.
fucking ridiculous. It's preposterous. A bunch of people in costume.
What is the point of that? Is it so that everyone kind of looks the same? What is that?
I think it's you
Isn't
know,
there a lice origin to it?
Part of I don't know where it comes from. I'm sure there's some. I think maybe like in the time of the Revolutionary War, I think like Thomas Jefferson and all those people wore wigs, you know, like it was a fashion thing, like a white wig. But I think it's preserved in the courtroom because they want to get the procedure exactly the same every time, so that even if the outcome doesn't turn out right for someone, people will say, well, at least the procedure was followed. And so that's why it's always a wooden mallet. It's always a black robe. It's always, you know, in England, a white, you know, it's sort of
yeah.
preserved in
Powdered wig.
amber because of this need
Interesting.
for constant procedure.
Huh.
Yes. I do think there's a lice background to it, though. We'll do it in the fact check. Rob, earmark that. I do think there was some kind of health reason why they were all wearing wigs in the chambers. But regardless, I don't
Makes
think the lice
sense.
could jump through the wig or some shit. I don't know. We'll find out.
Stay tuned for more Armchair Expert, if you dare.
And then what did you find there? Did you find anything
So what
startling?
I found was, you know, that was around the time when the sort of opposing worldviews theory was finally accepted. And, it was like I could retire on that. That was fine.
Yeah.
But then my day-to-day life in Hong Kong completely overturned that for me because I would walk into campus every day and I would see the students from the universities that I taught at there. And they would be walking in little groups on the sidewalk, chatting softly in Cantonese, greeting other people formally, making way if an elder person was coming on the sidewalk, being very well-mannered.
Yeah.
And then they would cross the gate onto the campus. And the campus is a Western space in Hong Kong. Classes are in English on most of the campuses. And because it's a multicultural society, like a lot of the workplaces and the schools are in English, but people live in purely Chinese neighborhoods with purely Chinese families. And so people span these two worlds every day.
Yeah.
And what I would observe was that when they would cross the campus gate, suddenly the group conversation would switch into English without missing a beat, mid-sentence, switch into English. And then people would be laughing louder. They would be standing a little bit different, high-fiving friends. And
Tall
I was
poppying.
Yeah. And so I was like, at the time I was struggling to learn the most basic rudiments of Chinese and Chinese social customs, which, never even learned my own culture, learning a second culture was
You
very
rejected
difficult.
yours and then tried to pick up this one.
So I was constantly offending people and, sort of stepping in it, and they were just without any seeming effort or even awareness, they were switching from fluent Chinese behavior to fluent Western behavior.
Yeah.
And so that made me think that we don't have these like stable worldviews, but these cognitive frames are situationally triggered.
Yeah.
And so I started doing research on what we call code switching now, in popular culture. And in research, we often called it frame switching. And we would run all these experiments where we would have the same experiment, like an experiment with the fish Rorschach test, or an experiment where you have to say how you would resolve a conflict. And we would either run the session in Cantonese or in English with Hong Kong students. And they would make different choices when they were operating in Cantonese, because it would just bring all their Chinese frames to the foreground compared to when they were answering in English. And even we would put like a poster in the back of the wall of Mickey Mouse or of a Chinese dragon. So even these like iconic images were triggers, or the architecture, like a vase, a Western vase or a Chinese vase. So things that are touchstones of the culture bring it to the surface.
You yourself as the participant don't feel those switches per se. You don't feel yourself code switching. I don't think we're very aware of it. I think we think in our narrative self, we're the same person moving through all these situations.
Right.
But we're not.
I think the first times you do it, which, for someone who's like African-American and, having to know how to behave on the street and know how to behave in school.
Yeah.
They're learning this stuff by the time they're 6 years old. Yeah. And then it's automatic. Like any habit, it saves attention for other things. I think it became, a celebrated pop cultural thing when Obama was president, and Key and Peele just dined out on it for years. All these funny, things about Obama, but just also things with each other where they kind of trigger each other.
Or his angry interpreter.
Yeah. So funny. But also that's really funny. Like it circles back to what you said at the very beginning of this episode. You were like, I'm triggered by people who are triggered with words.
Oh, uh-huh.
And this example is like language is so important. It informs the way we literally see the world and make decisions. So it is important. Like
I mean, you're transferring thoughts. That's the magic of language, right? It's like this impossible thing that I'm going to take what's in my brain and give it to you to experience through this medium of language. So it's
so for me, it's like it's okay to be sensitive, because there's a ton of meaning behind language, like more than we know, for sure. Of course.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
My issue with swearing is a class warfare hierarchical thing, but yes, I accept it fully.
Language is really tricky because it's both something that gets triggered, like in code switching of a politician in front of a different audience. But then it's also triggering, right?
Yes.
When you hear, if I get a phone call at work from a high school friend, I start behaving in a way that my colleagues don't recognize because I'm back to that small town high school experience,
Yeah.
In the past decade or so, most of my work has been about sort of cultural complexity and how people negotiate it and the variety of situational things that are triggers for different layers of culture. And then also how culture changes, how people learn new cultures throughout their lifespan and how collectively a culture will shift. And I'm sort of fascinated by just the inflection points. Like we're all old enough to remember when they was not a pronoun for one person, right? It's really only been the last 5 years or so that very effectively, the LGBTQ community and its allies have, not by coercion, but just insisting that we would prefer that everyone do this. It would be considerate if you do. And now if you don't do it, you're considered to be obstinate.
Right, exactly.
And so I was noticing that, that this town is still called Los Feliz by most people.
Yeah.
But I suspect that in the next decade, it will become Los Feliz. And not because it's becoming more Hispanic, because it's becoming more hipster.
I mean, it must have started out as Los Feliz. I don't know how it changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Over
It's
time.
certainly not spelled Los Feliz.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's obvious to anyone.
I was asking my friend last night, and she said something like people switch into Los Feliz in December because Feliz Navidad is like
It's on the front of their mind.
so it's kind of on the bubble now. It's kind of the convention could switch.
I'll move when they start calling it Los Feliz. I'll be like, okay, I aged out. I got to move now.
Why? You can just call
I
it
know.
It's
just
unclear
teasing.
whether it's pretentious or authentic.
that. Yeah, that's the line. That's the
yeah,
fine line.
I'm always quick to assume it's pretense. That's my own baggage.
Except you also do call it orangutan and Neanderthal.
Because that's what it's. Yeah.
Yeah,
I say both of those wrong.
Me too, because I feel like it's pretentious to call it the proper way, but really we should probably just be calling everything the proper thing.
We should make an effort.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so now we land at your book. Sorry, that was a long walk, but I enjoyed the hell out of it.
It's the first time that I've often expected questions about my research past, but I've never gotten them before. So it was fun. It was fun to finally tell someone about it.
Okay, so the book is called Tribal, but tribalism in general has become really popular. I think as a result, we'd agree in the polarization of the country over the last 10 years. And I think a lot of social scientists have tried to step in to help us understand what's really going on. And I think there's been some interesting political debates where they're really figuring out two people they're arguing about identity. They're not these issues that seem to be the issues they're arguing about. These are really identity core. So I think it's gotten popular, but I think in its popularization, your book at least would warn is it's a kind of a limited explanation of tribalism and that there's more to it. And it's not just this negative thing. I think it's taken on and I think I use it quite often that way, as us in group, out group, us, them, that these are problematic. But your book has got kind of an optimistic point of view, and it's saying, sure, all that stuff's true, but it's also the catalyst in the fuel behind everything great we do too.
Yes, and it is a mutable, malleable force. I started writing this book because, I had done this research and I've taught at business schools, at Stanford Business School, at Columbia Business School, and various business schools around the world for shorter visits. And so I've kind of developed a toolkit of how my knowledge of how culture changes and how culture can be triggered is useful for leaders or managers or teachers, parents, anyone who's trying to motivate and orchestrate other people, sort of leading them through their culture. So I've been kind of teaching that for decades. And I started writing a book. Okay, I'm just going to write about that.
Yeah.
And then while I was writing over the last 5 years, it was meant to be 1 year, but it took 5 years, tribalism became this meme. And it started with the pundits, like, Tom Friedman wrote a very influential article saying, like, we've we've caught a virus of tribalism from our Middle East adventures, and now we regard the opposite party as an enemy, a mortal enemy who must be defeated, instead of as a fellow citizen.
It's like we've descended into tribalism.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And then it was step by step. Tom kind of made it sound like, oh, it's it's like encephalitis
We caught it
on
from the Middle
vacation.
East.
But then Andrew Sullivan wrote this piece where he said, a deeply buried, evolved drive has resurfaced in our moment to create blind allegiance and hate and distrust for outsiders and to blur our view of reality. And that was, in the wake of Trump being elected. And I think a lot of people felt that way, like what bomb went off to cause, this world that we're in. And then more people picked it up. Sometimes now it has been called toxic tribalism. The LA Times had a big
your book introduced me to that term. I hadn't heard that yet, but of course that's so natural.
Because people say it's killed a lot of people because, Republicans didn't want to take Biden's vaccine, and then political violence killed people. So this trope of toxic tribalism, I think, is quite dangerous because it's despairing. At worst, it's like fatalistic doomsaying. And I've even seen several of these articles, like the genie has gotten out of the bottle and there's no way to put it back in again. And I'm like, okay, is this metaphor really helpful for thinking about policies that might ameliorate the situation? I mean, it makes for interesting journalism. It makes for good speeches. Politicians have picked it up. But I think it's a little bit fatalistic. It doesn't show the way to manage or to lead people out of problematic ways of thinking. And I, as someone who's been studying this thing for decades and reading, I read a lot of the evolutionary anthropologists. There's a guy at UCLA, Robert Boyd. I don't know if you had any contact with him, but if they had Nobel Prizes in anthropology, he would get it. He's probably done the most important work in the past 30 decades to build these models of cultural evolution. And they're really mathematical models, and they're kind of by analogy to biological evolution. And so I've tried to incorporate everything that's been learned in that field with everything that's been learned from the experimental psychology that I do. And I think that we have a real toolkit that we can use to manage in the short term which cultural identities are affecting a group of people that we're a part of or affecting ourselves. And then to manage over the longer term, to guide the evolution. The evolution will happen organically, but we can also guide it by, giving experiences to a group that will affect them and will update their preconceptions about things. And so the book started as really just, sharing what I teach, but it has taken on a different agenda, which is trying to counter this meme or this trope that I think has led to a sort of cynical, despairing attitude towards the crises in the world.
Or maybe, in worst case, it would be apathy and acceptance.
Just this kind of resolution of like, we can't do anything. We're wired this way. We're wired to hate, that kind of thing. It's like, that's not the main story of the human race. I mean, there was a species like that. It's called Neanderthals. They went extinct because there was this other species that was mostly about community, and that's our species. So it's kind of not a fair picture of what the tribal instincts evolved for solidarity and collaboration. They didn't evolve for hostility. The hostility is just a byproduct of, a chain of things that happens sometimes.
And again, as you say in the book, like context dependent. Occasionally the in-group bumps up against the out-group in a manner where that altercation is inevitable. But more often what you're seeing is the group just kind of expand and invite more and more people into the in-group, right?
Groups expand, and that's the arc of human civilization from, kingdoms to nations to empires to the UN to the internet. It's larger and larger, more and more inclusive networks.
Even in this dismal current state of affairs, there is a silver lining in that minimally 150 million people agree on one thing, and then 150 million people agree on another thing. Those are pretty big numbers. Right? Like, that's a pretty fucking big in-group. Even though it sucks that that's the case.
Well, and actually, most people all agree on the same thing. It's like there's just a few people who don't agree.
Right. And we misperceive the other faction as though everyone in the faction holds the most extreme beliefs in the faction. So your average liberal Republican and your average moderate Democrat don't differ.
Exactly.
No. Yeah.
And that's most people.
But
Yeah.
you have a fun personal anecdotal situation that I would imagine also drives you to write this book, which is you were involved in the Hillary campaign in some capacity, and you were at the Jarvis Center when when that world ended for all Democrats.
Yeah. It's on the far west side of New York. It's a building with a very distinctive glass ceiling. So the Hillary campaign chose it as their site to celebrate this historic victory.
They needed something fitting of the accomplishment that was inevitable.
And there were many other, celebrations, in New York and elsewhere that all ended in this sort of fiasco-like way. But and everyone there was so convinced that victory was inevitable.
course. Yeah.
We gathered in our living room for a celebratory viewing of what we already knew was coming.
Yeah. And it was just one of those moments where, what? It's like, did somebody take over CNN and, broadcast, did CNN get hacked? It was so hard to reconcile. Really, we're not that polarized
But
now.
you end up in an Uber. I think this is really fascinating.
Yeah. So I was there and I was, with some people that I had been working with, but I just felt my mood shifting towards rage.
Yep.
And so I know enough about myself to better to be out of a crowded room when I might, start arguing with somebody. So I sort of wound my way out through, layers and layers and layers of, gathered crowds, all of whom were dazed and stupefied by things. And then I couldn't find a cab, and there's not a subway around there. And so I'm walking for blocks. And then finally I get an Uber pool that's available. And I'm like, sure, okay, I'll take anything. And I hop in, this, 30-ish woman, pearls, nice silk dress, flashes me a big smile, and I'm like, oh, what a nice person, I didn't consciously register, but it was the first smile I had seen in hours,
Right.
And then she trilled, oh, are you coming from the event? And I was like, at the Javits Center? And she said, no, at the Midtown Hilton. And then I remembered that Trump, who also lives in New York, was also having an event, not too many blocks away. So Uber didn't, Uber should have been aware to separate.
A fist fight in the back of this thing.
So then I'm sharing a ride with her, even though we're not sharing realities. Because I had to ask. At first I was like, one of them, and then I was so curious. I was like, were people at your event surprised by the outcome?
Yeah.
And she's like, not at all, because everyone hates her, and he's been surging in the Midwest because people are. And she had knowledge that I had been completely unaware of about Michigan, for example, and about some other places. Yeah. And, I had been working in the campaign as part of this group of social scientists who kind of advise campaigns. And and it just started my process of realizing I'm not seeing reality in its complexity. I've been pulled into a conformist process of getting my news from websites of people who agree with me, and then checking my understanding with people who completely agree with me, and then becoming more and more confident in my worldview.
But that is that they weren't shocked is really, I think, really telling. It's really good. It's a cool observation.
I think the reason for it is, and there's a lot of research evidence showing this, that both the right and the left think that, their views are just reflections of reality, whereas the other side is in the grip of some distorted
Fox News
ideology.
Or CNN, pick your side.
And so because of that, we each think the center agrees with us. So because of that, even when the polls are close, we're like, well, but surely the independents will come our way.
Yeah.
And both sides believe that. And that's why there's a lot of election night surprises increasingly, not just in this country, but in other countries where groups, really are shocked. And then the surprise turns into election denial, easily turns into
yeah.
election denial. And that's the danger of it.
And you're fair enough to say we did it too.
We did
The
it
left
too.
did it in Georgia.
We did.
The right did it nationally.
We did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Both sides do it.
Yeah.
Because, and you can get a little sympathetic to it because it's like, it's their reality. I was just watching last night. There was 60 Minutes did a thing on Sunday about the January 6th people that are in prison, some of the ones that were prosecuted, not. And they have this gentleman talking who participated. And he said, well, you have to understand, like, we weren't overthrowing the government. We were saving it. The election had been stolen. It was a fraud. It wasn't a democratic election. And you're like, yeah, wow. I get it. Like, I don't have that opinion, but I get it. You're not overthrowing. You're protecting the government. If there was a huge fraud, you have to get in there and restore it. It's not let's overthrow it, make it something new. So it's just like, yeah, your perspective and what you believe in. Yes, if you do believe it was fraudulent, like we believed in Georgia, you're pretty much willing to do some stuff.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like Donald Trump, but I think there were very well-intentioned people who were part of that. Yeah. And then there were just fun-loving people who were part of it. That it was just like a rowdy thing to be a part of.
Yeah, there were bozos and dum-dums that they would have been at like a free popsicle giveaway. Yes. And then there were some people that really thought they had witnessed something that had never happened in our history.
True patriots, right?
Yeah,
True patriots who, like the Tea Party people, they saw themselves as like the Boston Tea Party colonists who were defying the law. You have to break the law in order to
save. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just really, really important to minimally, as an act of good faith or goodwill, like to grant people that they're sincere about what they're saying. I think that's minimally what we have to do. I think it's very favorable for both sides to go like, they were lied to. That's why they think that. They're misinformed. They're dumb. They're these things, or that's not really that. It's bullshit. They're really trying to destroy. It's like, let's just grant each other the notion that we're trying to make things better.
Tribalism is often an accusation, like they're being irrational, they're being primitive, they're being emotion driven. But I think we should honor the intention of the other side because the intention is often symmetrical to our own intention. Right now at my campus, we had a situation where the political protests, which started out as something I was proud of the people on both sides. I was proud of my Israeli students and colleagues for speaking up and expressing grief and educating people about the situation. And I was proud of the sort of anti-genocide coalition, which is a very inclusive coalition. It's very small percentage of people are Palestinian, and there's probably more Jews than Palestinians on that side, right? But it escalated in part because both sides were co-opted by outside groups that were more extreme, that had different agendas. And there were certain triggers, the kinds of things I write about in the book, like symbols and ceremonies, which are like situational triggers that bring extra layers of cultural thinking that sometimes get in the way of critical thinking. And so lots of stupid things were said, but these are 19-year-olds. We shouldn't expect Gandhian discipline. They're not, they were taking a math class the day before. They don't do this for a living.
They had like a pimple that they were thinking of not going to class over.
So
earlier that day.
So I think there were arrests and there are procedures, and I think it's quite appropriate to scare them, do something scary. But I don't think that we should be all that punitive in a long-term way. Some of my colleagues really disagree. But we are proud of what happened at Columbia during the Vietnam War, and we are proud of what happened at Columbia during the apartheid years, which was sort of like my years in college. Columbia was the first campus to have shanties and protests, and it spread throughout the country. And when Mandela was released a few years later, that was one of the factors cited, that it had spread internationally.
Did you happen to read it was a New York Times article that I really loved, and then I ended up reading the person's book, and then we had them on even. But the framing of that college situation was laid out like this. Forget about left and right being a battle between the issues, and think of it much more as two different worldviews. The left being the world is a battle between the oppressed and the oppressors, and we must protect the oppressed. very legitimate point of view. And then for the conservatives, the worldview is life is a battle between barbarism and civilization. Also very true and very legitimate. You can see countries without law and a functioning judiciary. We know what the outcome is. These are both really defendable points. And they were materialized so perfectly on that campus.
Yeah.
And I think my frustration is that, and this funnels into tribalism, is like, there has to be a winner in that. There has to be the right or the wrong, the good or the bad, the evil or the protectors. I don't know. Those both seem like pretty valid points of view to be expressing.
Exactly. And there are campuses where you had a kind of dialectic, where you had a negotiation involving both groups and the administration. Rutgers, for example, was one of them. Northwestern was another. But Rutgers was interesting because the leadership at Rutgers said, like, well, if this is an opportunity to make Rutgers better, if Rutgers can learn something from this crisis, we should. And so that was a very face-saving way to say, okay, some of the demands from the anti-genocide coalition, like hire more professors who have a knowledge of Palestinian and Arab issues. Another issue I thought was really interesting in terms of tribalism, they said, we want parity in terms of the flags that are flown on campus, because apparently there were some centers at Rutgers or whatever that, flew Israeli flags, and there was no place that flew a Palestinian flag. And so that is interesting thing for Rutgers to learn, right? That symbolic parity in a public space, and it's a state university. And so I think they took the right attitude, and there were many demands that they did not accede to, like we will divest from companies that do business with Israel, and we will drop our partnerships with Israel.
So the book starts out very fun. Again, I'm going to parallel it with the Korean Air chapter in the Gladwell book.
Okay.
But you start with South Korea is going to host the 2002 World Cup.
Yes.
And they have been abysmal up to this point. They've been really terrible at soccer as a nation.
Lately they've been.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'm not being fair.
They kind of won the World Cup, co-hosted with Japan, arch rival, in the mid-90s when they were riding high. They sort of clawed their way up, throughout the 20th century through colonialism and war and, political turmoil, and then kind of emerged as this like successful economy in the 90s, moving into the elite tier of nations. And their soccer team, the Reds, was a regional power. It was like winning the Asia Cup, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And so they got to be host nation. And then the Asia crisis came in like 1998. And not only did their economy tank, but they had to get embarrassing bailouts from the IMF, and they were accused of crony capitalism, and kind of there's a lot of, sort of patronizing language, by the international institutions. So it was a really humiliating moment. And their team, the Reds, started like losing to Kuwait and losing to like really tiny countries.
Like 5-0, 5-0, 5-0. Getting slaughtered.
Stay tuned for more Armchair Expert, if you dare.
And so they were the host nation. And it's really embarrassing if you're the host nation and your team is terrible. So the head of the Korean soccer bureaucracy called this soccer coach in the Netherlands, who had a sort of mystique for being able to bring out the talent in teams, and not just in the Netherlands. He had coached in the Netherlands, but he had brought foreign players to Dutch clubs in a way that people hadn't done before and made it work. And then he went to Turkey, and then he went to Spain, and he was able to kind of work his alchemy, in all of these places.
And sports is a really fun little microcosm of tribalism, because there are these existing pillars of belief, which is the Spanish players were more improvisational, right? And the
matadors,
Dutch, matadors, and
the Brazilians
Dutch,
samba on the field, and
samba, and he brought a Brazilian.
The Germans have Teutonic discipline, and the English are shopkeepers.
Pragmatists.
It's really this kind of national character rhetoric that you still hear during the World Cup. The old commentators engage in it, but it makes no sense because we know that 90% of the year, these players are playing in clubs all around the world, intermixed with all kinds of things. So the idea that they have a fixed programmed playing style as a function of their nation is something projected onto reality.
It's a great place to just look, because all that stuff is so steeped in tribalism.
And Hiddink, was someone who was like a pioneer for not believing those things and thinking that, the so-called Dutch style of total football could be brought to Spain.
And even his Dutch style had been influenced by the some Russian.
Right. It was just the Dutch style because the Dutch, made it famous. But, it drew from certain things that had been done in England and certain things that had been done in Moscow. Yeah. And he came to Korea. His first impression was of an ignoramus because he not only didn't know any words of Korean, but he didn't recognize the names of the star players like the Messi or the David Beckham of Korea. He didn't get their names. And he's kind of he's not only Dutch, but he's from a rural farming region in the east of the country. So he's really down to earth.
It's like a Ted Lasso.
Yeah. Well,
that's what this sounds like.
It's a little bit of a Ted Lasso story, right?
Yeah.
Where he knew the sport, so that was different.
Yeah.
But he's a fish out of water. His particular bias, which is this kind of down to earth, egalitarian, no formality bias, was in some ways exactly what the Korean team needed, because the Korean team had certain habits of play that were, in fact, influenced by the hierarchical nature. Like in the Korean language, as you were saying before, if I'm addressing you and you're older than me, obviously you're way younger than me, but I have to say something like san in Japanese that acknowledges that you're my senior.
Yeah.
And, Hiddink observed early on, he's like, what are they saying on the field? And the coach would give him a little translation. So they were using these honorific declensions when asking somebody to pass to them, right?
And they were playing in their hierarchy. So if they had an open shot and they were a rookie, they would pass it to a veteran out of deference and they'd lose the shot. Or they would be shining the shoes of the veterans if they were a rookie. Or they would make a loud noise to warn a veteran they were about to score. I'm like,
oh boy,
all this stuff that was getting in the way of victory as the game is currently played.
I don't know whether Hiddink was aware of what had happened at Korea Airlines a few years before. This was years before Malcolm's book, Outliers, which I think was like 2006 or something.
Yeah.
But Malcolm talks about something that was, in the academic literature that, researchers at Boeing discovered that if they looked at all the national flag carrier airlines and they looked at crash rates with 747 class jets, which require equal collaboration of pilot and co-pilot, unlike previous jets, the countries with the highest crash rates were not the ones you would expect. They were essentially Taiwan and South Korea. Neither country has particularly bad weather. Neither country is poor.
They have a military with an air force where the pilots had equal hours up in the sky.
Yeah.
They had already lost the right to fly through some airspace, and they were on the verge of losing their right to fly through Canada's airspace.
Yeah.
There was so many accidents.
Boeing even considered redesigning, having one plane designed for hierarchical cultures and one for egalitarian cultures.
The reason they were crashing wasn't their skill level, it was that the co-pilot's job is to point out the errors of the pilot and vice versa. But when the senior pilot was making an error, the co-pilot would either say some very mitigating statement and not really shine a light on what was going wrong. And then it was really the structure of pilot and co-pilot was rendered useless in this hierarchical system.
Right. And the really chilling evidence is from the transcripts of the black boxes in the cockpit. So these transcripts were published, and the conversation would be, the co-pilot would be saying something like, "Sir, what about the mountain issue?" And it would be, "Stop it, I'm trying to concentrate." And then it would be, "Sir, we might want to change course." Indirect.
Knowing they're about to fly directly into a mountain.
Right.
And then the transcript ends, And so in Outliers, the story is told mostly as a story about, how cultures differ. But what the aspect of the story that to me was the most striking was that Korean Air, to its credit, said, okay, well, all pilots speak English because that's the international language of air traffic control. So let's make our official language of the company English. So the cockpit language will be English. Didn't have to fire anyone.
Yeah.
Maybe they had a few English classes and they haven't crashed since. The same people in the same planes, that there's nothing inherent about these Korean individuals that made them prone to this interaction.
I think it's one of the most hopeful stories I've ever read in my life.
Yeah.
It's just that there's a problem of that magnitude that could be figured out and could be solved is so encouraging. And this soccer one is equally
he did
so.
the same thing, the soccer coach.
Yeah, he announced all these weird rules, rules for the training camp. And, one of the rules was no use of honorifics on the field. And he rationalized it as need for speed, right? Need for efficiency. But some of the other rules were, we're going to hold the first training camp in the United Arab Emirates, not in Korea. And the Korean sports press are not allowed to follow us there and interview you after every scrimmage, about your mistakes. And so these were all justified in terms of efficiency, but you could see, and people at the time could see, that he was changing the cultural cues around people. He wasn't telling them to change. He wasn't even telling them how he wanted them to change, but he was creating a situation that made some identities less salient and other identities more salient.
Yeah.
And that helped them learn a more modern tactical system, this total football system. And, there were other times when he wanted them to think like Koreans, and then he created a situation that was like intensely Korean. So he is just good at pulling the strings, recognizing that in any player, there are multiple identities and multiple loyalties, and that you can be a puppet master sort of by knowing what situational cues or what experiences will update somebody's assumptions about the group that they're a part of. I've never met the guy, but I found him to be an unlikely prophet about this, because he does in his interviews always talk about players are a lot more adaptable than you would think, and he will say, like, I played in many different countries and I saw that people could change. And so he definitely had some conscious awareness of this, but I think some of it was just he kind of understood how to tweak the situation until it gelled.
And they got to the semis and it was compared, this moment was compared by the media to their end of colonialism and some other, and statues were erected. Like it was as big as it could get in Korea.
Yeah, they put up statues of him. They put him on a postage stamp. They named the stadium instead of World Cup Stadium, it became Who's Hitting Stadium.
Wow.
And then they wanted to make him an honorary citizen, and they couldn't because Korea, like many countries, had a blood standard rather than a soil standard of citizenship. So you had to prove Korean ethnicity. And so they changed that, which was from time immemorial. And that's regarded as sort of an inflection point in the South Korean identity, a sort of symbolic and literal openness to the world, and a sort of a level of confidence. Like we can open ourselves to citizens who aren't Korean without being threatened by it.
We won't lose our identity in this process.
Right.
Yeah.
In some ways, you gain identity from it because you regenerate an identity in this generation, which is slightly different and more interesting. And one idea of authenticity is that the culture can never change. Another idea of authenticity is that it must change. And that if you're doing what was done a generation ago, then, well, that's a museum piece. That's not the real culture. That's the view of culture that I hold. And I think it's more progressive.
So you break up three distinct ways in which tribal psychology works. The first of which is an instinct to imitate and conform to what most people do. And I think there is one part in here that seemed specifically the people that are nurturing you, I think is really relevant. Like the group that's nurturing you, you will instinctively conform and imitate them.
Yeah. Something that I remember from listening to some of your past podcasts that you talked about is nature versus nurture. Right?
Yeah.
And like when I was going to school, that was the binary frame that would always be on day one of a class, you would take the evolutionary psychology class, and they would say, these other classes, they told you it was nurture. I'm going to convince you that it's all nature, 99% nature. And then the anthropology class would be, the brain is a blank slate, and there's one culture where the women stand up to pee and the men sit down, and there's another culture where,
So it was a major of anomalies.
Yeah.
I think that's why I liked it.
And so what I think has emerged, due to, a lot of the great work that's been done at UCLA at this like Department of Anthropology and Brain Sciences or whatever. It's like an interdisciplinary department, that human nature is nurture. What we are genetically programmed to do is to learn to just absorb like a sponge from whatever community is nurturing us. And we are also programmed to teach, to the people we are nurturing, and we do that without even knowing that we're doing it. We are teaching and we are learning. And, other social animals are more wired to behave in a specific way. So, an ant colony in California is exactly the same as an ant colony in Michigan or in New York. But a strip mall in California is different than a strip mall in Manhattan, because we are wired to learn from whatever is nurturing us. The culture's differentiated, but within the culture, we still have seamless coordination. We don't have constant collisions because we know to mesh with each other through our shared habits.
Yeah.
And that's what I call the peer instinct. And it's sort of the foundation of human culture. And even the earliest humans were able to collaborate and coordinate, operate together with a shared goal through these common habits, these common understandings in a way that, other primates cannot. And that was, like one big step towards tribal living.
Yeah.
And then the second one, which you guys have mentioned a couple times already, is heroes, the hero instinct. And that was a new layer of psychology where if the peer instinct was conformist, doing what's normal, the hero instinct is this drive to do what's normative, to do what is regarded as moral or aesthetic or a valued contribution by the community.
Like exceptional.
Yeah, in the book you say emulating someone that is held in high regard.
Yeah. And just like with conformity, there are things that conformity leads us to do that are bad, where we give up our independent thinking, et cetera. But my argument is that most of conformity is good and enables us to do things collectively that we wouldn't otherwise do. Similarly, with the hero instinct, there's the silly kind of emulation. So like when Elizabeth Holmes wore Steve Jobs' black turtlenecks, that didn't help Theranos succeed. And we see a lot of that in sports where people want to know what LeBron eats for breakfast. So it can be done, but it operates for the most part in a really dynamic way because imagine a sort of farming community where maybe the soil is changing and then a few farmers start planting yams instead of sweet potatoes. I don't even know what the difference between yams is. I know they are different. And then they sell more crops than the average person. Well, in the next decade and in the next generation, more people are going to start doing that because they're going to see, okay, these people have success and status. And so I don't know if the yams are what caused it, but I suspect that it might be. Yeah. And so that way you have adaptive cultural change, collective level learning where the group shifts in the direction of what is working through this hero worship drive.
Well, that's why you need this balance of individuality and collectivism. Someone has to be producing the emergent quality. Someone has to be divergent, right? For us to navigate the changes and adapt.
The human existence is one where we're constantly feeling conflicted between these different drives that we have, the drive to conform versus the drive to stand out. The third one is, some people are surprised that it's the last one to evolve because it sounds in some ways like the most primitive, which is the ancestor instinct, which is the drive to perpetuate the ways of the past or the ways of past generations. And that created tribe level memory. It led to a sort of hanging on of the wisdom of the past, so that the wheel didn't have to be reinvented every generation, and the hero instinct energy could go into building on the past rather than just recreating it. And, we can recognize all of these things in ourselves today. We have this curiosity about founders.
Yeah, the founding fathers are deities at this point.
Yeah, we learn a little bit about our family history. We see a old photo and we want to know about this person. We want to know, what did that person do for a living? And old family recipes. We have this inordinate curiosity and this sort of sense that it's the right thing to do to perpetuate and propel these traditions forward. And it can lead to sort of blind conservatism, blind traditionalism, but it's also very useful. The way that we're wired is that even things that are not immediately practical, we feel like we should perpetuate. And that led to art and other symbolic traditions. You would see, look, we came into a cave and there's painting on the wall. We don't know who did that. It looks kind of old, but let's learn how to do it and let's do it in our cave. And none of this had any practical value, but it prepared them for things that were practical. So if you have this routine of sort of learning by rote of things from the past, well, then there might be some sort of way of making a spear or way of making a fishing hook that is sort of too complex for you to really understand why it works, but you can still do it because grandma taught you to do it this way, and you're going to do it this way. And she looked over your shoulder when doing it and made sure that you did it this way. And you're going to make sure that the next people do it this way. And so this technology that is very useful is being passed on despite people's inability to understand exactly why it's done that way.
Right.
All three of these things, conformity, status seeking, and, sentimentality and nostalgia, blind rote repetition of the past, they are things that I grew up thinking of as human embarrassments, like aspects of human nature that are holding us back from our rational core. But I've come, through studying this stuff for decades to think that these things are actually the distinctive superpower of our species that evolved, that leads us to behave in certain ways that allow for social organization. And they're not completely rational, but rationality doesn't solve every problem. Like global warming is not a problem that rationality will get us out of, because behaving in your individual self-interest leads to overconsumption and not worrying about future generations. And so some of these tribal logics may have a better chance of changing behavior in the ways that are needed.
But of course, they do lead us astray, right? Is it Ash's work? Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yeah.
Where he demonstrated through these experiments.
Yeah, that was sort of the famous work in the early 60s that, added a lot of fuel to this sense of like, conformity is a danger, which I guess it was in the 1950s, right? It was, and what he showed is that if you bring a group of people like us together for like an eye test, as a group, and I don't know that you two are actually in cahoots with Ash. I'm the only real experimenter. You're fake subjects. And then the first couple rounds, when asked, is that blue or green? We all say blue. It seems like trivial question. And then after a few questions, you guys start giving the same wrong answer. And then I, as the real subject, I rub my eyes, I clean my glasses, I scratch my head, I kind of look at people like, are you guys goofing with me? And then a very high percentage of people in my role start to give the wrong answer along with the majority. Yeah. And then the question that social psychologists struggled with for a long time was, are they just paying lip service to that so as not to be ostracized? Sort of a sort of conscious conformity that is not so deep.
Is their perspective change?
Is their perspective changing? Like, is your answer becoming a frame that when I look at this teal shaded square, I start to see the blue in it,
Yeah.
And so they've done some studies in recent years where people are hooked up to an fMRI machine, and you see, it's that light bright psychology where you see which part of their brain is activating. Yeah. And the people who conform, they're seeing both the part of the brain that handles, social conflict and the amygdala that handles any kind of threat, and the part of the brain that handles visual perception beliefs, so there's some belief updating going on. So it does seem like there is some top-down influence on people's perceptions. Yeah, conformity is deep, and it can lead to wrong judgments, especially in these rigged situations.
Yeah.
Well, you wonder that when you're evaluating the outgroup. I do this myself. I find myself going, do they really believe that? Or are they smart enough to go like, well, I don't really care. I'm just with this group. Mm-hmm. And it's probably both things.
Right. I think the two judgments we make are, one, either they're not sincere.
Yeah.
They don't believe this. They're just saying it because they're rich and they don't want to get taxed.
Yeah.
Or they actually believe this, which shows that they're so deep into this,
Cult.
Tea Party, ideology that they can't see the world clearly anymore. So neither of those is very charitable.
Right.
True.
Yeah. When we talk about the hero instinct, emulating someone with high regard, pride versus shame is interesting, and I think worth pointing out some of the potholes we step in, which is there's so many experiments at this point that show people behave much differently when they're being observed. If they're a philanthropist, they're going to give more when there's celebrities in the room or there's other philanthropists in the room. If there's a honor system to pay something, they pay one thing when people are present and a different when other people are present.
Or even if there's a poster on the wall of watching eyes above the honor system coffee pot, people are less likely to cheat. So it's a lot of these mental mechanisms are very trigger happy, right? So you don't need like the full flown, like peer group watching me taking notes, even just the hint of eyes, or even just the reminder of the group will cause you to think in terms of the frameworks that you share with that group.
And that's like a reputational driven behavior to preserve our reputation in our group.
Yeah, but not always conscious calculation about reputation.
Yeah.
Like shame is a really interesting emotion. It's like shame and pride are like a system. And traditionally, both Christians and like therapists, the psychoanalytic therapists, have regarded them as dysfunctional. Like pride goeth before a fall. Or the psychoanalysts always said, shame is paralyzing. It's not a constructive emotion. It leads to, all sorts of bad behaviors.
Yeah.
And when scientists, behavioral scientists started running sort of rigorous studies of all the different social emotions and what their consequences are, and doing it across societies, what became very clear is that pride and shame are not about self-consciousness and dysfunction. They are a system that evolved such that when we do a thing which is valued by our community, we feel pride. And we feel it automatically. Olympic medal winners everywhere, even in the Paralympics, the blind judo people, they all have the nonverbal expression of pride, which is
chest expanded,
which evolutionists say is it's a way of calling attention to yourself, as opposed to shame, where you slump and you kind of try to make yourself invisible.
Yeah. They
They say that the pride shame system is like a good PR agency in that it broadcasts your successes and it hides your failures. And it's kind of designed both to induce you to do the things that will be appreciated and to not do the things that won't be appreciated, and to make it more obvious when you have done the good thing and less. And it's not all good, because it also leads you to do things like, hide your mistakes and, take credit for things beyond what you. So it's not all good. It's not the moral emotion, but it's sort of the ethical emotion, in the sense that it's trying to make you appear virtuous and trying to avoid having you appear unvirtuous.
I thought there was a neat outcome of this, a hunting and gathering group in Africa. Yeah. And what's interesting is, and it makes so much sense, which is if we act differently when we're being observed, and yet we're now gathering in groups that are thousands and tens of thousands in civilizations, you're milling about the world, but you're not actually seeing people that know you. So that's diminished that power. And it's interesting to see what kind of gods develop in response to that, which is most of these huge civilizations developed all-knowing, all-seeing, omnipotent gods to stand in for your group. Whereas a group like the Kung, they're always with each other. There is no milling about with strangers. So you're actually observed. So their gods are not these all-seeing, all-powerful, all-knowing gods. It's a fascinating outcome, I think, of that.
Yeah, you get these nosy gods. You get these high gods who are both omniscient and awfully concerned with what humans are doing.
Each person,
like,
all 8 billion of us.
Once you get social scale that allows for anonymity, that I'm doing things where nobody who knows me can see, and where I might, hurt another person. And so it's sort of like the big security camera in the sky that causes us to behave nicely. And outside of religion, we do the same thing with like Santa Claus. Like he knows if you've been good or bad, and we perpetuate other myths. Like in public swimming pools, when I was growing up, there were signs saying like, if you should have an accident in the pool, a cloud of blue dye will appear. And the cloud of blue dye never appears,
no
and you would think you would have seen it. And I once worked as a person, however, I had to go to pool supply stores because I was, doing maintenance for things. And they sell the signs, they don't sell the dye because it doesn't exist. Because sweat would have the same reaction. So it's just a myth that we perpetuate to get good behavior.
Stay tuned for more Armchair Expert, if you dare.
You walk us through how we've evolved to have all these aspects of our tribalism, and then you give great examples of how lots of good comes out of them. The ending chapter is about this toxic tribalism. So when I'm stuck in my pessimistic view, I don't think this is something that we will ever transcend. I don't think we will remove the vestigial tribal component from our in-group, out-group thinking. And then I go, well, what would it take? And then I go, well, it'd have to be an outside enemy that was so threatening that we'd get our shit together here. Like I go to the, it's got to be the
Martians.
worst.
We need the Martians.
Yeah, Martians or Russia's really got to launch an attack. Or, I have only really negative ideas of how we could make this whole country one in-group. But how do you see it? And how are we a little astray in our summation of all this tribalism?
Well, I think there are very deep, trenchant, disturbing conflicts, in our politics, in our race and ethnic relations, and across religious lines, whether it's people shooting up a synagogue or civil war in Darfur. There's a lot of conflict going on. But I think that's true in every generation and probably will be in every generation. And it is the case that most generations think that civilization is unraveling on their watch, right? And you can read Socrates, talking about the youth are, no longer studying the way we did. So I think there will always be conflict for sure. I think what's new is the way that people are talking about these conflicts, the toxic tribalism trope that we are sort of wired to hate outsiders, because hostility is a part of all of these conflicts, but they don't start from hostility. And thinking that they start from a hardwired hostility is not a useful way to think about the conflict that you're in or the conflict that you might want to try to ameliorate. So I think that there is not just one kind of tribal thinking gone awry, but there are several varieties of it that come from these different tribal instincts, the peer instinct, the hero instinct, and the ancestor instinct.
Yeah.
And in the last chapter, I argue that the red-blue rift is largely something that emerges from the peer instinct, from the conformist information processing. And so I call that epistemic tribalism. It's a tribalism of the mind when tribe comes before truth. And we're seeing the world through the lens of our shared tribal beliefs rather than reality, but we don't have the metacognition to realize that. So we blame other people for the fact that they disagree with us. And there are steps that can be taken to lower the heat, to dial it down.
Yeah.
There's a whole industry of red-blue bridge groups that has sprung up in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think some of them are doing it the right way and some of them are not doing it the right way. So a lot of these groups are called things like High from the Other Side or Red-Blue Encounters or town versus gown, like things like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly wrong because you're inviting people to an event where they're going to be paired off with somebody, and you're basically saying, you're going to be paired off with one of them, and so there are some evidence that those kinds of interactions actually polarize people.
Right.
But there's evidence that when we don't know that the person that we're talking to is from the other side, or even if we know that, if we're talking about, there are other groups called Make America Dinner Again and Coffee Party USA, Open Lands USA, where it's let's bring bipartisan groups together for dialogue around shared passions that have nothing to do with politics and that cross-cut the two sides. And those are more likely to create a conversation that continues beyond the event, right? Because if I love coffee and you tell me about a cafe in this neighborhood, I'm like, well, what about next Wednesday? You want to meet there? So it may seem like an indirect route, but it's a better route than setting up this oppositional thing.
Yeah. I've seen some cool experiments where there's a few of these out there that I've seen. One is like, they make them talk about like 6 topics before they're allowed to launch into, they'll get given this divisive topic. And the outcomes after they've had to do these 5 is drastically different than when they start there. The other one was I've seen, they have to build a piece of furniture like IKEA, or they have to have some physical project. And they're not allowed to talk about anything political till the end. And again, the outcomes of those are drastically different than when you start with that.
I'm actually kind of surprised about that because I would think then you'd feel a betrayal.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that like, but I thought I knew you and I thought we were friends and now I find out that we're actually so different. Like that would be my instinct. Just like when like your parent, I think for people who have family situations where they disagree politically, I think that's really intense than when it's a stranger who you're just like, well, I don't know them, so I don't have any investment here.
For sure. It's the act of, it's us two against this piece of furniture. So like we're an in-group.
No, I know. But
and then like you're in-group, and then you hear that they're out-group. I think what it does is it right sizes what it means to be an out group. Because you've just experienced another version where they're an in group. And now you're questioning the boundaries of in group, out group. I think, is that?
Yeah. But I mean, as you kind of alluded, the research in this area, it's highly variable. Like they haven't quite figured out all of the parameters that matter. And it's related to a longer area of research called the contact hypothesis, where like in what situations, if you bring Israeli kids and Palestinian kids at a summer camp together, will you have attitudes become more accepting as opposed to polarizing? And it requires that they have equal status. It requires that they are working on projects together where they need each other. There's this concept of the jigsaw puzzle classroom where you have to, you can't solve the problem unless each kid contributes their knowledge. But it's fragile. Sometimes the equal status is artificially created and it's not really believed, or you start building trust and then somebody says something and then it's like they grew an alien head, and you feel betrayed because you thought you knew who they were. So it's a complicated situation, but there are better and worse ways, and they're not. A lot of well-intentioned people would think that the best way to create the event is to highlight that it's a red-blue dialogue group. That's not the thing to emphasize.
A cool point you make is that these 3 instincts that have evolved, they have evolved specifically to mesh with peers and strangers and to help a group. So it does seem crazy that they would all of a sudden be completely maladaptive and non-functional. And we're talking about some of like kind of micro examples of how it could happen. But what do you think can happen on more of a scaled up version for us?
When we talk about where tribalism goes awry and contributes to group conflicts, I think it goes awry in several different flavors, and one is this epistemic tribalism, of sort of like living in different cognitive worlds. And there are some things we can do to try to communicate with a person. Like there's a lot of evidence that if I'm, say, a liberal environmentalist and I'm trying to get a few more conservative votes, like when they were working really hard to get Joe Manchin's vote for the Inflation Reduction Act, which is called the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's the biggest environmentalist law that's ever been passed.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but it was labeled in a way that was friendly to the people on the margin, right? Inflation Reduction Act. And the classical default thing is that your liberal will say, we need to stop global warming because it's an injustice to the poor people who live closer to the ocean or to the future generations. And that's the logic of social justice. And it resonates really well with Democrats, but it doesn't resonate as well with conservatives. But what other moral logics resonate better with them, like the rhetoric of sanctity. So if instead the message is, we must preserve this God-given earth and prevent the blasphemy of, I'm maybe laying it on too thick. And they send clerics, to lobby. But the idea is, work with the symbols and signs, speak their language, bring their language to the fore, and then they can see a basis for saying yes to this, which comes from their commitments rather than asking them to come from your commitments, And then aside from the left-right conflict, I kind of argue that there's a different kind of tribalism gone awry in the racial discrimination and ethnic discrimination. And there, my thesis is, I would say probably a contrarian for a lot of people, but I argue that the racial discrimination in the workplace today comes not entirely from hostility to the outgroup. In fact, I think that may be a relatively small part of it. I think it comes from, I would say, maybe benevolence or, favoritism towards the in-group.
Yeah, preservation of the in-group, perhaps.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the part of the hero instinct is that we are wired to contribute to our clan. We are wired to contribute to the community, not to all humankind, but to our community.
Whoever's doling out the status, really.
Exactly, the relevant status for us, right? And so we have lots of mechanisms of hiring and promotion in organizations where I'm a manager and I'm making a subjective judgment about, is your high school experience leading the motorcycle club, is that a leadership experience or is that something I should be worried about? Whatever it would be in anybody's case. So I have to make these subjective judgments. I also make a lot of judgments about whether to give you the benefit of the doubt, whether to give you a little more time, than was allotted for the interview. And I think we impulsively give these kinds of things to people who look like us or who are, kind of have last names similar to us.
Yeah.
And so that is in-group favoritism. And I think that's a stronger force. And what's really problematic is that HR departments have adopted procedures in the last couple of decades that turbocharge in-group favoritism. So one of them is hiring for cultural fit. The idea is the corporate culture is important. So when we're looking to see who to hire of all these college students, if you see people that you think would fit in well with the current partners in terms of their extracurricular interests, we'll give them an extra star. There are anthropologists who go into corporations, and one of them, a woman, Rivera from Northwestern, has written a great book where she kind of was a fly on the wall in blue chip law firms and blue chip consulting firms and blue chip banks, the same organizations that had restrictions on who could work there, generations ago. What she observed is that they place an inordinate emphasis on the high school and college extracurricular activities of the people they're hiring. And they say things like, oh, well, with her squash background and Dax's crew experience, we can imagine them being a really good team on the trading floor, and the sports that they seem to harp on just happen to be these like waspy sports that only exist in elite suburbs. And those elite suburbs today are demographically diverse, but they're still class-wise, it's a particular way of living, right? That hiring for cultural fit, it's a permission structure for this kind of in-group favoritism. Yeah. And then another one is referral systems. So companies now, if you're applying to be a manager, if you just apply externally, you have like 1/10 the chance of being hired compared to if you are referred by one of the employees of the organization. And the way the referral systems work is if the employee refers someone who gets hired, they get a financial incentive.
Right.
And they also get a friend coming into the organization.
Yeah, win-win.
And so companies have learned that referral hires come on board more quickly, stay longer, lots of good things in terms of efficiency. But guess what? They're not diverse. They tend to look like the current employees.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But some companies have tweaked the referral system where it's still a referral system. Like you're asked, do you know anyone in your work life or social life who might be a good fit for our new head of HR? And we're looking for people who are either veterans, LGBTQ, neurodiverse, or from an underrepresented minority. Well, it turns out you're just as good at coming up with 20 people. They're not the 20 people that you would have come up with if you didn't have the target, but you can come up with the 20 people and all of the same advantages happen. You feel commitment. They have a friend.
Yeah.
They can learn from you, so they have someone to show them the ropes and they tend to work out and stay longer. So just by becoming aware of in-group favoritism as a big part of the problem, you can start to see that some of these innocent procedures are making it way worse.
Yeah.
And there are limitations in how well you can measure racial animus, right? Because people don't want to admit to it.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to get a real answer out of.
But all the indicators that do exist suggest that it still exists, but it's a small set of people, and it's not, for the most part, the people who are in power. It's the disenfranchised people, right?
Yeah.
But discrimination is still really, really widespread. It's not happening from hostility. It's happening from this, like if I see the name, Jamal Jefferson versus Paul Smith, it's not necessarily that I feel hostility at Jamal Jefferson. I might feel a little warm glow at Paul Smith.
Familiarity.
Or some affinity, right?
Yeah.
And so there's reason to blind the names, in resumes when you're doing hiring, and there are reasons to tweak the referral system. And
I agree with you quite a bit on that assessment. Obviously, there's fucking white nationalists and there's hate groups, and that's all true. But I think it's putting a little too much focus on the thing that's not going to move the needle.
Well, I agree. As a minority, I agree that the things that have affected me aren't hatred. It's not like people hate me. It's just more, it's a more favoritism toward the hegemonic group. It's, So I think it's dead on.
Unfortunately, you don't have any controversy here. Maybe some other hosts would have been able to push back really hard on that.
Oh,
you said it was a little controversial.
Well,
it's
controversial because like Google spends $1 billion a year on its DEI training, and 2% of their technical employees are like women and underrepresented minorities. So what they're doing is not working. It's not hitting the real problem.
Yeah.
There's become a sort of diversity industrial complex now where there's this whole profession of biased trainers and instruments that reveal your hidden prejudice, and most have a shaky scientific basis. But it's a good Band-Aid when something bad happens in a corporation. I'll bring in a bias trainer. It's a sort of ritual obeisance to but it often makes things worse. And some data shows that after bias training, companies are less likely to promote minorities, and it's thought to come from the fact that people become shy about any interactions across racial lines or gender lines because the feeling is I might commit a microaggression and then I might get canceled. And,
Yes. They get scared. Yeah. Well, this is fascinating. I'm really grateful to hear a somewhat positive take
too.
on it because, it's singularly negative. I perpetuate that quite often.
I don't think that our democracy has been destroyed, and I don't think civil society is dead.
Yeah.
I think we just need to understand where the levers are and learn to manage ourselves better.
Yeah. I agree. And I really, really enjoyed getting to talk to you and learn about you, and hope everyone checks out Tribal, how the cultural instincts that divide us can help bring us together. Hopeful. And I do want to put the finest point I want to put on it is it reads like pop fiction. Like it reads like Gladwell. It's very fun. All of the cases, you're learning about all of these premises through actual stories about people, and they're all very, very, very entertaining. And you're just kind of picking up the wisdom as you get entertained. So good job.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's really great.
I'm really happy to hear that.
Yeah. All right. Be well.
Bye.
Thank you.
Hi there. This is Hermy and Permium. If you like that, you're going to love the fact check with Miss Monica. Hello.
Hi. I wondered if you
Harem pants?
Yeah, I had a feeling you were going to mention my pants.
They're harems, right?
Should I stand up?
Yeah,
Sorry,
give
Rob.
a stand up. Do a stand up. Do a twirl. Georgia girl, turn to the left, turn to the right. Do your thing on the cat.
Yeah, they're kind of clownish.
It's got a circus vibe, fun, fashionable circus vibe.
Yep. I got these at a vintage store in Austin.
Really?
Yeah.
How old do we think they are?
Ooh,
Is there any way to know?
I'm sure there's a way to know. Let's see. What if I typed in what year are my pants and it could do it? Oh my God. Speaking of, I was with Jess this weekend or end of last week, and he has a ChatGPT on his phone.
Okay.
And he was like, I want to name my guy. Let's ask him what he wants to be named. So we were like talking to him.
Okay.
And
And he
it's
speaks in a voice or in text?
a voice.
He does.
Like very, in my opinion, human-like voice.
Okay.
It's kind of like when on Synced, when Liz had her AI boyfriend.
Right.
It's similar to this.
Okay.
But Jess was saying, I'm with my friend Monica and we want to give you a name. Oh, I just said, say hello to Monica. And he says, hi, Monica. I hope you guys are having a great day. What do you think my name should be? Like it immediately can really understand and then turn it into a colloquial back and forth.
Sure, and engage you.
Yes. And at one point I said, Jess, I want to talk to you.
Ah.
And he said, Monica's getting mad that she's not getting all my attention. And then it laughed.
No.
Yes.
Oh, wow. It knew that was a joke.
Yes.
That's good.
I'm really afraid people are going to start turning to it for true companionship. I mean, Jess was getting so into it.
So you're nervous Jess in particular is going to...
I think a lot of people, last week we talked about being lonely.
Long way.
And like, what if during my incident, I had...
Oh, well, you needed it. This is great. This is a big philosophical...
Yeah.
By the way, I heard Yuval talking, I think I even brought it up on a previous fact check, that he was being interviewed by somebody on stage at a live event, and he was saying, if you think about it, when you're talking to another human, the other human's just planning their next statement and thinking how what you're saying affects their own ego. In a sense, this AI thing would be a companion that is actually interested in you and actually wants to soothe you. That's really interesting. If you really think about what you're getting out of communication, what it's doing for you. If what you needed during your incident was comfort and it gave you comfort and helped you, why would it matter?
The AI is trained to give you what you want. And so that's good in certain circumstances, like probably a comfort circumstance.
Yeah.
Ding, ding, ding to our last fact check where we were talking about yes men and only getting confirmation and affirmation and not having anyone challenge you.
I imagine you could set the parameters.
No one would do that.
Well, you would. If that was your fear and you're like, well, I don't want this thing to warp my sense of my own importance and my own blah, blah, blah. You could set parameters, I presume, for it. Because you'll go like, I think I'm going to have Twinkies for lunch. Now, a shitty friend would be like, eat 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you've also told it your goals in life. Now, this goes back to Homo Deus, ding, 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 Yuval Harari again.
Easter egg.
You can give it your goals. Like, I want to be social. I want to exercise. I want to be in daylight this amount. You know, you could give it your whole dream list of who you would be. And so you go like, I'm going to think, Roger, I'm thinking about getting some Twinkies. And he could go, or she could go, well, those would be delicious, Monica, but it would take you off your goal by 3 days.
And even if you say, I want some light pushback, often in life, you don't want pushback, right? You can set that parameter, but then if you're getting it, if it's a real person, you have to engage. You have to stay there if it's someone you care about or
You can't
love.
go fuck off, Roger.
Yeah, you can't turn the person off.
Yep.
Like you can turn your phone off or just say, ugh, never mind. Or I'm resetting you to say something I want now.
I totally agree with that. But what would be interesting is, because neither of us have been advised by Roger yet, I haven't. What would be really interesting is if you even get defensive when Roger does it. Because so much of, I think, what our defensiveness is like, I like and value this person and they have opinion about me that's negative, and that scares me. So I wonder if even what might be interesting is, if does it nullify defensiveness? Like if my watch tells me you're a sloth,
Well, that's rude.
I'd be like, fuck you, you're a watch.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess one of my more immediate fears is like, you know what it is I probably have a fear that my skills will be nullified.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is what the whole strike, the AI portion of the strike was about. This exact thing. Like, well, if a computer can write a script as well as a human, is that okay? I still stand by, I guess it's okay. I think it needs to be declared.
Yeah.
And I think I, as a person, will always be more impressed by a human who can do something interesting.
Okay, now what about this? Could you say to Roger, look at all the sports information and write me a magazine right now? Could you publish this magazine? I think probably.
Yeah.
And what if it's better? And I'm a sports enthusiast.
Then you'll buy it.
But why would you buy anything? Couldn't you just tell your own Roger, well, I want a sports magazine too?
Exactly.
I'm not sure how this is all going to work, but we're going to find out.
If an AI makes the most beautiful song in the whole world, it's like gorgeous sound that I've ever heard, I might listen to that song.
Yeah.
But I won't never listen to a human song again. And I won't find it as impressive as even a human who maybe is doing 75% of that perfection. Like,
yeah, it's like when I do
magic.
fast math, it's still kind of impressive, but a calculator can do it really accurately and way faster.
Yeah.
There's still a room for me to be impressive, even though calculators exist.
Exactly. Yeah.
I would have previously said, before I heard that Metallica yacht rock AI hybrid mashup, I would have assumed there wouldn't be an AI song I'd actually love. But in truth, I love that song. I probably like it as much as a lot of other songs. The thing it'll be missing is like, it doesn't have what Steely Dan has, which is like, even though Steely Dan's songs, one of their defining characteristics is their songs are so different, kind of like the Beatles. Like none of them overlap. They're all unique, but by God, they're all Steely Dan. They have that fingerprint and they have some essential vibe that is Walter Becker.
Charles
Biden?
Lydon.
Is that
Charles Lydon.
Oh, Charles Lydon, our father.
Christopher Lydon?
Oh, fuck.
Christopher Lydon.
God
Poor Chris,
damn
man.
it. Oh,
We owe him to know it really well, and we're
I just
not doing
can't
great.
do it. Just can't do it.
Chris Lydon. Do you have a photo of him you could put up on the TV, Rob?
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's see if we can.
We could just have him up always.
Yeah, as a
on
guy,
the
as our
TV.
father. Can I tell you about one fun thing between Delta and I?
Yeah.
So when I drop her off from school, we kind of park and we walk a block to school. And we saw someone's virtually their whole wig. It wasn't a whole wig. It was all extensions.
Okay.
It was a huge amount of extensions.
Oh, boy.
And we had been listening to Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. Come on. And so we were walking down the street and we started singing, Don't stop till you get enough. Come on. Till your hair falls out. Leave it on the sidewalk. Come on. Till your hair falls out.
That's funny.
And it's still there this morning. That was like 8 days ago.
Oh.
And luckily, I think the thing about hair on a sidewalk is no one wants to pick it up. You would need
Yeah.
tongs.
Is that him? He's
Oh
so
my God, the cover of The
handsome.
Guardian?
Well, he deserves it. He invented podcasting.
That's Chris Lydon.
What?
Fuck. Thank you, brother. Father.
Thank you,
God.
Dad.
Daddy.
Daddy.
Dada.
Okay, we made it gross.
Daddy.
So quickly made it so gross.
You're my podcast daddy.
Oh.
Ooh. Hey, I can't
wow.
do that. I think the only
AI can't.
The only thing left will be like pervy grossness jokes.
No,
like
AI will be.
You
do you
think
know
it
how
can
many
understand?
pervy jokes are on the internet?
Yeah, but a vibe like
It laughed at the joke. It
it
knows.
was a good joke.
really good joke. And it laughed so hard.
Well, did his laugh sound like maniacal or friendly?
It was layered. It was like, oh, I get that's a joke. And also like, oh, I feel a little bad for her. She shouldn't feel like this.
She's being replaced
She's
by
insecure.
me. She
And
has low self-esteem.
I feel it.
Yeah, she's probably had an incident recently. Has her on
What
tilt.
if it asked?
Monica, by chance, did you have an incident recently? Hey, did we ever, because there was a lot of justifiable complaints about the fact check not containing our chimp crazy debrief. Have we done it?
Yeah, we did.
Okay, great.
We didn't do it on Catherine's.
But we did it. Okay.
It's to come.
Okay,
Well,
great.
it happened
Yeah,
on this.
it's
by
next
this time.
month.
Yeah. It's last week and then add a month.
Oh, one other thing I wanted to say in the comments that made me really happy is someone again asked, like, why aren't you in the attic? You know, for me, it's like we're a month into this. Like, you
And
got to
people
understand
still-
Monday's the attic, Wednesdays is the studio. But someone was nice enough to write. And they wrote, at Dax Shepard, they said, hey, Dax Shepard, I'll take this one.
Oh,
And then they
that's
said,
sweet.
Here's how the
I
schedule
understand,
works.
though. I think it's important. I think maybe me and you got too hasty. Like, we said it once or twice, and we felt like we said it all. And maybe we
You
need.
think so?
Yeah, because there are some podcasts that I listen to that do say the same. Like, they say updates,
Right.
like for a year. The same update to tell people, and we haven't done that, but maybe we should. Okay,
Yeah,
so
I
let's-
just think the baseline armchair is so smart. I really do believe that.
they are, but also we have new people. We hope.
I think the bigger issue, which is very fair, is there's many people don't listen to every episode. So it's like, yeah, we did it for 2 or 3 episodes, and we're like, yeah, we're good.
Yeah,
But it's very common for someone to have missed 3 episodes. Then they listen. They're like, what's happening now?
okay. Let me tell people about our show. Okay, so
okay.
we have a show called Armchair Expert
Uh-huh.
with Dax Shepard.
Uh-huh. Is it about the messiness of being human?
It is.
Uh-huh.
It's about incidents.
What's the incidents of being human? It's about human incidents.
It is actually.
And what's our schedule?
Okay, so our schedule is we have 3 episodes for you a week.
Yeah, oh my God, that's a great offering.
I know.
How much does it cost?
It's free.
Oh my God, okay. Wow, you've got me
free.
on the hook.
And where can you listen?
And where can you listen to this?
You can listen anywhere you get your podcast. Anywhere. That
Hold on,
means-
could I listen on Apple Podcasts?
Yes, you can.
Could I listen on Wondery?
Absolutely.
How about Stitcher?
I think.
Spotify?
Yes.
Great.
Yes, you can. You can listen anywhere you get your podcast. And look, if you're like, I don't get my podcast, I don't know what that means, then on your phone, if you have an iPhone, you do have an Apple podcast icon. It's purple.
Came preloaded.
Came preloaded. So you do have it.
And then you could search in apps for the Wondery app or the Spotify app or the
Exactly.
Stitcher app or the iHeartRadio app. I'm assuming all these people have apps.
I'm not sure.
I think so.
We release an episode on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Monday is a celebrity interview.
Okay.
It's Dax and Monica talking to a celebrity friend. And we're really interested in incidents and the messiness of being human and vulnerabilities. And we're not really interested in people's highs. We like addiction. We like poop.
Uh-huh.
And then
Are those audio or video?
okay, great question. Thank you for asking. It is audio
Uh-huh.
only.
Yeah.
However, you can watch it on YouTube. You won't see us.
The conversation.
You won't see the conversation, but there'll be some visuals. But the fact check, which happens at the end of each episode,
Uh-huh.
the end of Monday and Wednesday's episode, the fact check.
Yeah, this
that's-
is confusing.
It
I can
is.
understand why
Yep,
people are
yep,
upset.
Me
Yeah.
too. Okay, so that's just Dax and Monica, and they're checking the facts from the episode because everyone makes a lot of claims that need substantiation.
Right.
But also the fact check, more than facts, is just Dax and Monica really catching up on their thoughts and ideas, opinions. Sometimes they fight, sometimes they cry, and sometimes they laugh.
Yeah.
And the fact check is always on video now.
Interesting.
Yes,
Okay.
but if you don't like video, you don't have to watch it.
Hold on. I
You
remember
can listen completely.
I remember an episode, I even want to say it was Bobby Lee, where Dax made a huge stink about that he would never do video because it would ruin the integrity of the vulnerability.
Sure.
So he's a liar and he's a hypocrite and he's sold out for money.
Well, I think it's not very nice of you to speak that way about my friend.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, we are keeping the integrity of our celebrity guests. That's why on Monday there is no video because we do want to keep that intimacy and make people feel very comfortable and feel vulnerable.
Not point cameras at them.
We don't want cameras. We don't want them to feel like they have to put on makeup, any of that. So that is why we are not doing video on Monday. But let me talk about Wednesday.
Oh, I can't wait to hear.
Wednesday is when we have an expert on. We have professors, we have mathematicians.
So like knowledge driven, not vulnerability driven.
Exactly, although sometimes vulnerability seeps its way in there.
Sure.
And so those are really, really fun. We don't feel that needs as much preservation of intimacy because, as you said, it's more knowledge-based and less vulnerability. So we thought it would be nice for people if they so choose to see our faces and see an interaction. A lot of people really enjoy YouTube. Then they have that.
I've heard there's a whole demographic of people, more than there are even on podcasts, that they're on YouTube and that's where they're going to stay forever. They're not going to go to a platform. So this seems like a good idea if you want to bring this knowledge to people who only consume on YouTube.
It's a great idea for that.
Yeah.
And if you want to see the fact check and see Dax and Monica chit-chat and cry and laugh and fight.
Recount their day.
Yes. That you can watch that, or you don't have to watch anything. You can just listen as you've always been listening on any of the platforms. And that's our show. Oh, and then Fridays. Okay,
What happens Fridays?
We have Armchair Anonymous. That's a really fun show that we do with our listeners. And how that works is we put out prompts at the beginning of each month.
Oh, fun.
It's tell us about a time you broke a bone. Tell us about a time you had an unauthorized evacuation.
Ooh, that's up my alley.
Yeah. Tell us about a time you were on the news. Like we'll put out a prompt, 4 prompts.
Yeah.
And people can go to our website, armchairexpertpod.com, and you can submit your story.
Yeah.
And if you get chosen, then we chat with you for about 15 minutes and you tell us your story, and then
this seems to answer a question I read a lot in the comments. Why don't you interview a normal person?
Oh, well, we do.
So Friday, I think it sounds like you interview 4 normal people every Friday.
I think we're not interested in calling people normal on this show.
No, this is what they're saying in the comments.
I know. I'm telling them that we don't really use that word.
Okay.
It's not very. No one's normal.
Right. Well.
Yeah.
Okay.
No one's normal. We're all
special.
We're all special unicorns.
Just like everyone else, though. That's the normalizing part.
That's right.
Yeah. Well,
and
I can see where people.
Show.
That's confusing.
That took 20 minutes.
Yeah, and when I hear it laid out, it is very confusing. I can concede.
So now you have
that.
some compassion.
But I don't know what else to do.
I think we're going to have to do this every week.
Every single
episode. Yeah.
Okay, I think people will probably stop listening.
Well,
it's kind of like we're teachers in a classroom and you got to account for, you want to move on to long division.
Yeah.
But people are still struggling with the multiplication.
Do you think the teachers should move on for those advanced kids, or should they wait until everyone understands?
Well, that's the struggle. I guess you're trying to balance that because you don't want to lose the smart kids and get them bored and they start doing drugs in the hallway or whatever.
Yeah.
It's tough. Boy, when you think about it, now I'm being sincere.
Yeah.
Well, it's impossible. You're aiming at the average, and we know about the fallacy of the average. You're probably excluding more people than if you would just pick one side or the other.
Right. But I guess that's why it's good if schools have programs for children who are a little bit above average and children who need a little extra help.
Yes.
So there's other time.
Yeah.
For both of those
Yeah,
groups.
and then you get into, there's only so many
resources, I know.
Yeah, it does, when you really think about it and you're generous, we're also critical of school, either they test bad or this or that. Mm-hmm. It's not an easy job to execute.
No.
You got 30 kids and they're all different levels.
Yeah, it's really hard.
Yeah.
But when AI
that is
teachers,
one of the things. This is one of the few things I argued with Bill about,
which was a weird argument.
You couldn't see my point.
I really could not. Because
I'm coming from such a specific dyslexic place.
I know, which to me means I would have thought you would be extra on board. Well, tell people, when we were in India with Bill Gates, we sat in on some meetings. We're not really supposed to talk too much about the details, but there was like a presentation of an app that would help students, because in India there are so many languages.
Yeah.
And so
that's what it was. It was the technique that was explained. I was like, well, that wouldn't work for dyslexic.
Sure.
So I think that's what I got hung up on. But probably there's versions that they would develop that would work for a dyslexic.
Yeah, exactly.
But just what it scared me about was like normalizing some learning strategy. Because like the AI is going to go with the probabilistic route. Well, 98% of kids would learn good if you did it this way. And then it's not going to do an unprobabilistic result. Although you could type in, I suppose, how do dyslexics best learn, and then use the probabilistic thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly easy. It probably, when you first start the app, you take a test.
And that would be good.
And it shows, so it learns how you learn.
This kid's fucked up in this quadrant.
In this domain. And so then you put your homework into these things and it helps you learn in that way.
Did I tell you about I had some testing when I was a kid, but it wasn't terribly comprehensive. But then I did it at UCLA to get extra, well, actually so that I didn't have to spell correctly on tests.
Oh, yeah.
That was like 8 weeks of testing. I had to go once a week, and you do so many cognitive tests. And what they're looking for, and what was so apparent on mine, is you have all these columns, and what they're looking for is like some baseline and then a complete trough.
Yeah.
And I had that.
Yeah. You had it in spelling?
Yeah, and I'm going to brag. I even set a couple of records.
In the drop?
I did. Like my pattern recognition column was the best they had ever tested.
Really?
And then I had a column that was among the lowest they ever tested.
Whoa, that's interesting.
The dyslexic part.
Yeah.
And so
it's very addicty of you.
It is. It's very in keeping with my overall personality. Real high.
High highs and low lows. But
it's comforting though.
Yeah, I'm sure.
For me.
That would be comforting for me too. But also, if your pattern recognition is so good, why did you stop playing Connections?
Maybe because my pattern recognition?
No, because
I wasn't that great at it.
You were good. You were really good, but you weren't perfect.
I wasn't perfect.
I think you should maybe get back into it, because you and Callie dropped off at the same time, and now it's over. And
I'm sorry.
I'm mad about it.
I did play it a couple times recently, because now the girls will ask me to open it up. Oh my God, I took a picture of it. Does this happen to you all the time? I got Wordle. I don't play Wordle.
Yeah.
But I got it on the second gas.
I always screen grab it if I get it on the second.
I screen grabbed it. The girls they thought their dad was like a god from Mount Olympus.
That is luck.
It's funny. It is and it isn't. Like, for anyone who plays Wordle or doesn't, you start and you can write a word that has 5 letters in it. And then it'll tell you which one is the right letter and in the right place. And then it's got another color that says that letter is in this, but it's in the wrong place. And so when you first see that, you go, this is impossible. But then really, it's crazy how patternistic writing is. It's like if there's an A as the third letter, it really limits it pretty quickly. Or there was an I, and I was like, I's are hard to put in that fourth. You're generally going to have an A before that. And then you start, I
mainly chalk it up to luck if it's a 2. If it's a 3, I start adding in skill. I start giving myself a little credit for skill.
Okay.
And then from then on, it is definitely like, it's a what letters could go here in the English language.
Anyways, the girls are asking me when we're bored. In fact, we were waiting for our in and out order, and we knew there was like 30 numbers before ours. And so they were like, let's play Connections. Yeah. We played that. And then it was, well, let's play Wordle.
Nice.
All prompted by them.
That's
it's
great.
Pretty fun with them because I like to hear them think out loud.
Okay, so today I didn't do that great. I got it on 4, which is not very good.
Yeah, that's pretty shitty.
Wow.
I'm teasing. I don't really know what's
well, my
good and
first
bad.
word was crane. And I only had one letter that was yellow.
Oh, what letter?
E.
Okay, we can work with that. So it's not going to be at the end.
Yeah, that's what we know. That's
So
the only thing we know.
It's going to be in the second or third spot.
Uh-huh. Correct.
Yeah, and that you got rid of some good
Actually,
consonants.
sorry, not correct. But that is what I did.
Oh, what was the word?
Modem.
Oh, yeah, they fucked you.
Well, no. So I did crane, then I did smelt, and
Wild. I mean,
and then I did moped.
really close.
It was close. I had 3 in the correct place and 1 in the incorrect. So then it was clear to me that it was modem.
Okay.
So this is fun.
Good job.
That's really
It's
fun.
just a fun fact.
Okay, let's do a couple facts.
Let's do some work.
Okay, this is for Michael Morris. Tribal.
Loved it.
Very interesting, fascinating topic. Okay, Dirty Dancing was filmed in multiple locations in North Carolina and Virginia, including Mountain Lake Lodge,
Which is on Lake Lure.
Lake Lure, Grove Park Inn. I love Grove Park Inn.
Where's that? Georgia?
Asheville.
Oh, it's in Asheville.
Yeah, it's the fancy hotel there.
Oh.
Yeah.
More
I
than
always
the Bilt.
wanted to stay there.
More than the Biltmore.
You can't stay at the Biltmore.
Oh, they don't have a hotel at this point?
It's
They
Grove Park
should.
Inn is like that is the fancy,
The
great
historic.
hotel.
Oh.
And Esmeralda Inn.
Replicating the Catskills.
Yeah. You said Ann Arbor is tiny. Ann Arbor is 28.7 square miles, and it's 119,875 population.
But what's the total enrollment at U of M?
Oh,
I bet it's in the 50 plus. That's a big ass school.
okay. 51,000.
So we got to lob that off, right?
Well, why? They live there.
I think of a town with 60,000 people who own homes and permanent residents.
As small.
Yeah, it's kind of a small. Considering how many people know the town Ann Arbor.
Sure.
Versus, and it's not our state capital. Most towns of 60,000 people don't know the names.
Yeah, but I think we know the name because of the college.
Yeah.
I forgot something to say about our show.
Uh-oh. More confusion?
If you like our show so much
Yeah.
that you want it a week early,
Uh-huh.
you do have that option.
Oh, you do?
Yes, on Wondery Plus.
Oh, okay, great.
So you go to Wondery Plus and you can pay
Uh-huh.
to get our episodes a week early.
Do they still have the ads in? Because if I'm paying, I don't want to hear ads.
There are no ads. It's ad free.
Oh, that's what would get me there. A week early, I don't know, but ad free, that'd be for me.
Ad free. And also, you can get 3 months for free to try out Wondery Plus to see if you like it.
How do you get that?
You
Go to armchairexpertpod.com.
I think you go to Wondery Plus and you can click Armchair Expert and then you can figure it out.
Okay.
Yams versus sweet potatoes. They are different.
Wow. I'm glad I kept my mouth shut because when he said that, I thought, no, they're the same thing, but I'm not going to say anything.
Sweet potatoes are in the morning glory family while yams belong to the lily family.
Oh, wow. So there's a lot of people who have morning glory allergies.
Oh.
Tomatoes being among
I thought that
them,
was nightshade.
eggplant. Oh, you're right. No.
Oh, okay.
Nightshades. I don't know if anyone's allergic.
I don't know
to
about morning glories.
Morning glory.
Okay, yams aren't as sweet as sweet potatoes, and they are starchier and drier. Their texture and flavor are more similar to potatoes or yucca.
Oh, okay.
Yams have a rough, woody texture, while sweet potatoes have a smoother, creamier texture.
I like a sweet potato.
Yams have an earthy, neutral taste, while sweet potatoes have a sweet, spicy flavor. Oh, yams must be cooked before eating because they are toxic when eaten raw.
Good tip.
Very good tip.
They're probably inedible raw, though. They're probably super hard like a
I'm gonna
potato.
try it.
Like you would never eat a potato raw.
Oh my God, do you think that's what caused my incident? Do you think maybe I ate some
Raw potato.
yam?
Speaking of which, I just recently found out, I just stumbled upon 2 different articles independently talking about how dangerous keeping rice is for a long time.
Oh, really?
I guess it's really susceptible to a certain mold. You know, I eat fucking rice that's 3 weeks old. I got a new one I'm really on. It's going to sound gross to people, but I urge them to try it. It's elk, egg whites, and a ton of feta cheese. Doesn't that sound horrible? It doesn't sound like gamey.
Oh my God, it sounds
it's I
so
know.
disgusting.
Even when I'm saying it, like Kristen's like, "What are you eating?" And I'm like, "It's elk, egg whites, and and feta. And as I was saying, I was like, that sounds like the worst dish possible.
Yeah.
And oh my God, is it good? And I take a gluten-free tortilla. I took some chicken wire and I made a little tube out of the chicken wire. I put it in the air fryer and I make a taco shell out of the
cute.
tortilla that is gluten-free and high in fiber. And I cram it full of egg whites, elk, and feta. And girl,
You love it.
oh, is it tasty? I was like, I could open up a restaurant and serve these. Of course, I'd have to lie about what's in it because no one would see that list and think it was good.
No, they wouldn't.
But if you're daring and you're in the audience and you figured out our listening schedule, I really urge you to try it.
Here's the thing to remember, though. For real, you can do everything just audio as it was. Like, that's still available. The original thing is still there. I do want to reiterate that.
Also, it's a mess, and that's what we're saying is a messiness.
Messiness of being human.
Yeah, the show's no mess.
It's not a mess. It's just there's added stuff, and the added stuff is
It's only a mess if you're trying to get all the new bells and whistles.
exactly. But
Yeah.
you should.
Yeah,
But you should.
absolutely.
Now, I have a apology to make to Arizona State.
Okay.
I've been critical of Arizona State.
Yeah, and Rhode Island.
I'm not apologizing about
Okay,
that.
great.
I've been
It's a tough
little,
people.
I've been a little critical about Arizona State, mainly because of their amusement park that they have at the university, meaning
The Lazy
River.
Yeah.
It's just fun to sort of make fun of it.
Yeah.
I don't actually have any problems with it.
Also, what could be cooler than a
I
lazy
know.
river?
I'm just jealous.
Yeah, I'm jealous too. I wish UCLA. If I could have got in my lazy river and taken it to another class across campus.
Can you imagine, though, the germs? All these college kids with
Bunch of
STIs. It's a cesspool.
Yeah, the chlorine levels got to be pretty high in that thing.
Yeah. So Michael brought up Robert Boyd. He said he's a UCLA anthropology professor and that he's really awesome, that he would win a Nobel Prize if there was that for anthropology. But Robert Boyd is also affiliated with Arizona State.
Go Sun Devils.
I think currently he's there. He was at Duke, Emory, ding, ding, ding.
Boston.
No, Emory's in Atlanta.
Oops. I'm
Wow,
thinking
you
of,
really don't know where colleges are. This is
I'm thinking
interesting.
of Emerson.
Oh, okay. And the University of California, Los Angeles.
Okay.
All right. So he's at ASU now, and
It's impressive.
that's impressive.
Yeah.
So
Take his class.
if you're at Arizona State, once you get
You're
off your
listening to this
little
on the
lazy river,
If you're listening to this as you float down the lazy river,
hop off that river, get an STI screening.
you get screened for those.
And then take his class, Robert Boyd. Okay, I have one more fact.
Okay.
Barristers wear wigs.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I thought there was a lice thing about it.
I know you thought there was lice. I'm not finding that, but it started in the 1600s. Before that, they just had to have neatly trimmed hair and beards. Then in the 1600s, originating in Europe, wigs became a popular fashion item in the UK during the reign of King Charles II, especially among the upper class and aristocracy of the time. The wig was seen as a symbol of authority, and lawyers would wear their wigs in the courtroom as well as outside of it to show their status and power. Despite evidence suggesting some lawyers were hesitant to wear the wigs, by the end of King Charles II's reign, wigs were fully accepted by judges. A century or so later, the popularity of the wig waned. However, the tradition to wear wigs within the legal profession remained and became a formal requirement. Wigs are still commonplace in the courtroom, almost thought of as a uniform to maintain the long tradition and formality of the legal system. However, the wigs have undergone some changes. Originally, the wigs worn in courtrooms were fully bottomed, which would typically extend down past the neck at the back and sides and sit over the shoulders. Now, the full-bottomed wig is only used as ceremonial dress. The wigs most often seen today are bob-style wigs with much shorter sides all around and featuring a tail at the back.
Guys,
Oh, man.
I mean, of all the different ways that we've tried to elevate ourselves, that is the aliens watching that.
That's
There's a bunch of men
rough.
wearing long flowing hair wigs.
And women. Everyone has to wear
Well, there
them.
was no women in the court.
Well, now I'm saying
Oh,
now.
now.
Also, it says in 2007, a change in the rules meant barristers no longer needed to wear a wig during civil and family law courts.
Thank God. There's just some fucking heartbroken child talking about the divorce of their parents and some abuse, and we got a guy in a fucking powdered wig with a ponytail. That's like insulting. I'm so sorry. Can you remove this fucking Halloween wig you're wearing?
They're also no longer required in the UK Supreme Court. However, wigs are still a requirement for criminal trials in the UK. And whilst the requirement
Isn't
of
it
wigs-
true, sir? Then on the night of I'm so sorry. I will answer this question, but why are you in costume?
Whilst the requirement of wigs in the courtroom seems to be in decline around the world, many law practitioners in the UK still take pride in wearing them.
Do you think like a big moment, like getting your varsity jacket?
Yeah,
Do you think
letter.
like you pass the bar in England, you go get fitted for your powdered wig?
Probably. And you know what? Sure.
I'm not trying to shame you if you have a hair system or a hair piece.
That's it.
Okay. Well, I love Michael Morris.
Me too. We learned a lot.
And I love you.
I love you.
And I love Robbie.
I love
And I love the Armchaires.
Robbie. And I love you guys for sticking with this very complicated show.
All right. I love you.
All right, I love you.